Hello, my peaceful dreamers. I have been working on something behind the scenes that I am so excited about. And next week, I finally get to share it with all of you. So make sure you are following the channel, because you will not want to miss this one. So, tonight, we descend into candlelight and cold marble, into halls 3,000 years old, where power is never accidental, and nothing is ever quite what it appears. The Volturi call themselves rulers, governors, the necessary order that keeps the vampire world from tearing itself apart. But tonight, we ask a different question. What if every gifted vampire in the world is not a coincidence, but a consequence? What if the Volturi have spent 3,000 years quietly engineering the most powerful supernatural force ever assembled? One extraordinary human at a time. So, get cozy, get comfortable, and settle in. Because tonight, we are telling the entire story of how the Volturi breed super vampires. In the hills above the Tuscan city of Volterra, behind walls that have stood since before most of the world's nations existed, 3 men have sat in the same chairs for 3,000 years. They do not age. They do not leave. They do not need to. For 3 millennia, the vampire world has organized itself around them, around their laws, their judgments, their guard, their word. Other vampires come and go, building covens and losing them, wandering across centuries, accumulating power only to lose it again. But the 3 kings of Volterra remain constant. Aro, Caius, Marcus, fix points in an immortal world that otherwise refuses to hold still. To most vampires, this permanence reads as legitimacy. Something that has lasted 3,000 years must have earned its place. Something that ancient must serve a necessary function. The Volturi maintain order. They enforce the laws that keep vampire existence hidden from the human world. They punish those who break the rules. They stand between the chaos of unchecked immortal life and something that resembles civilization. Without them, the argument goes, the vampire world would tear itself apart. Exposure would follow. Humans would retaliate. Everything would end. This is the story the Volturi tell. It is told quietly, consistently, and across so many centuries that most vampires have long since stopped questioning it. It is told not through propaganda or proclamation, but through simple, relentless repetition. Through the way every vampire who visits Volterra leaves with the same understanding. Through the way every coven that has ever challenged the Volturi's authority no longer exists to offer an alternative account. The story survives because the storytellers have been meticulous about who else gets to speak. But stories told by the powerful, about the powerful, deserve examination. And the longer you look at the Volturi, the more their story begins to reveal its own seams. Aro came to power not through election or inheritance, but through survival. In the early days of the vampire world, before any formal governance existed, covens competed for territory, for hunting grounds, for dominance. The strong eliminated the weak. The old consumed the young. It was not a time of law. It was a time of war fought quietly, conducted in shadows, measured in centuries rather than battles. Aro navigated that world with a precision that other vampires, even very old ones, found difficult to fully explain. He made alliances that served him and dissolved them when they stopped doing so. He identified threats early, before they became dangerous, and neutralized them with a thoroughness that left no possibility of future retaliation. He survived an era that killed nearly everything else of comparable ambition, and he did not survive it by accident. By the time the Volturi formalized their position in Volterra, when they stopped being simply a powerful coven and became something closer to a government, the competition that might have challenged them had already been removed. Not driven away, not defeated in open conflict and allowed to retreat. Removed. The distinction matters. A defeated rival can recover. A removed one cannot. Marcus's gift is the ability to see relationships, to perceive the emotional bonds between people as clearly as others perceive physical objects, their nature, their strength, their direction. He can look at two people standing in a room and understand immediately who loves whom, who fears whom, who is loyal, and who is merely performing loyalty. He can trace the invisible architecture of attachment and devotion that structures every coven, every alliance, every negotiation. Love, fear, obligation, resentment, genuine loyalty, manufactured loyalty. To Marcus, these are not abstractions. They are visible, as clear and legible as the faces of the people who carry them. 3,000 years of this gift, applied to every vampire the Volturi have ever encountered, means Marcus has mapped the emotional landscape of the immortal world more completely than any other being alive. He knows which covens are genuinely unified and which are held together by coercion or habit. He knows which alliances are sincere and which are convenient. He knows where the fracture points are, where loyalty is thin, where a well-placed disruption would cause a coven to collapse from within, rather than requiring the Volturi to destroy it from without. He has watched relationships form and dissolve across 3 millennia, and every piece of that knowledge has always been available to Aro through the simple mechanism of touch. This gift, in the service of genuine governance, would be invaluable. Used simply to understand relationships, to mediate disputes, to assess the true nature of covens seeking judgment, it would make the Volturi's judicial function more accurate and more difficult to deceive, more just. But that is not, historically, what it has primarily been used for. Caius has no gift. Among the 3 kings, he is the only one without a supernatural ability beyond the standard enhancements of vampirism. His strength, his speed, his senses are exceptional, as they are for any vampire, but there is no additional power, no particular talent that sets him apart from other vampires of comparable age. What Caius has instead is a quality of cruelty that even other Volturi members find notable. He is the one who argues for execution when deliberation might find another answer. He is the one who pushed for the systematic elimination of the natural werewolf populations centuries ago. A campaign the Volturi conducted until the numbers of true werewolves were reduced to near extinction. Not because the werewolves posed an immediate threat to secrecy, but because they were the one category of being that could challenge vampires on something approaching equal physical terms and survive doing so. He is the one who favors punishment as demonstration, who understands instinctively that visible consequences deter not just the guilty party, but every witness and every vampire who hears the story afterward. Caius's cruelty is, in its own way, a strategic asset. It ensures that the Volturi are not merely respected, they are feared, and fear, consistently maintained across 3,000 years, is a more reliable tool of governance than any law written on paper. The Volturi's laws are few but absolute. Vampire existence must not be revealed to the human world. Immortal children, human children transformed into vampires, must not be created because they cannot learn control and will inevitably cause the kind of exposure that threatens every vampire alive. No vampire may challenge the authority of the Volturi in a manner that threatens the stability of their governance. These are the pillars of the system. Violate them and the Volturi will come, and they will not come alone, and they will not leave until the matter is resolved in the manner they consider appropriate. On their surface, these laws are reasonable. A secret society of predators living among billions of humans requires, at minimum, that the secret be maintained. The prohibition on immortal children is genuinely sound. Transformed children are incapable of the restraint that allows vampires to coexist quietly with human civilization over long periods. Their lack of control is not a moral failing, but a developmental reality. They simply cannot be taught what they need to know, and the consequences of their existence spreading have been catastrophic on the rare occasions it has occurred. And a governing body must be able to enforce its authority, or it ceases to govern. These are not unreasonable positions, but consider who benefits from each law, and in what proportion, and in what ways that benefit extends beyond the stated purpose. The secrecy law protects every vampire equally, in theory. In practice, it gives the Volturi justification to intervene anywhere in the world where a vampire is suspected of exposure. It gives them a reason to travel, to investigate, to arrive with a guard at any coven's doorstep anywhere on Earth. It transforms every vampire's behavior into a potential subject of Volturi oversight, because any behavior that risks attracting human attention is technically a violation, and it means that any human who learns about vampire existence becomes immediately a Volturi concern. Either that human must be killed, or they must be transformed. There is no third option the Volturi recognize. No possibility of a human simply knowing and living quietly with that knowledge in circumstances that do not involve Volterra. Every human who knows about vampires is either a casualty or a new vampire. And new vampires, depending on their gifts, may be exactly what the Volturi are looking for. The law about immortal children also deserves a second, slower examination. It is enforced with a ferocity that goes beyond even the genuine danger the children represent. The Volturi do not simply execute the vampire responsible for creating the child. They eliminate everyone connected to the offense. Coven members who may have been unaware, witnesses who happen to be present, anyone whose knowledge of the event represents a thread that might later need to be addressed. The thoroughness is extreme. and extreme thoroughness, applied consistently over 3,000 years, produces a cumulative effect on the population of powerful independent vampires. Covens that might, in other circumstances, have grown strong enough to present an alternative to Volturi authority are periodically reduced through enforcement actions that are entirely legally justified and simultaneously very convenient. Then there is the history that predates the formal laws themselves. The Romanian Coven is the oldest rival to Volturi dominance still in existence, which is to say that Vladimir and Stefan survived, while nearly everyone else of comparable age and ambition did not. They remember the world before the Volturi's consolidation. They describe, in the bitterness that has had centuries to become something almost geological in its density, a campaign of destruction so thorough and so methodical that they remain, after all this time, the only survivors of what was once a much larger and more varied vampire world. Other covens, Egyptian nomadic confederacies across what would become Asia and the Middle East, territorial groups whose names are no longer spoken because there is no one left who spoke with them, are gone. Not diminished, not driven to remote regions where they survive in reduced circumstances. Gone. The Volturi did not achieve this through force alone, because force alone is too expensive and too visible. An empire built through open warfare attracts witnesses, creates martyrs, generates the kind of collective grievance that can unite previously unrelated powers against a common enemy. Aro, across 3,000 years, has demonstrated that he understands this. Marcus's gift allowed the Volturi to identify the strongest emotional bonds within rival covens, the relationships that held them together, the loyalties and loves that gave them coherence and resilience when threatened. Understanding those bonds meant understanding exactly where to apply pressure to make a coven fracture from within before any open conflict became necessary. Trusted lieutenants could be turned. Beloved partners could be removed. The emotional architecture of a coven, once mapped by Marcus, could be disassembled one relationship at a time, leaving something that still looked like a coven from the outside, but had already lost the interior unity that made it dangerous. What remained of the vampire world after centuries of this process was not a diverse ecosystem of competing powers held in balance by the natural dynamics of strength and territory. It was a landscape in which only one power structure had deep roots, and everything else was surface growth. Individual vampires and small covens tolerated because they posed no threat, or avoided direct confrontation because the cost of it was too well established, or because they might eventually prove useful. And that word, useful, is where the Volturi story begins to reveal what it actually is beneath the governance and the law, and the careful language of order and necessity. Governance requires enforcement. Enforcement requires power. Power, in the vampire world, is not simply a matter of age or physical strength, though both matter significantly. The most decisive advantage in any conflict between vampires is gift-based. A vampire with an extraordinary supernatural ability is worth, in any serious confrontation, many times the number of vampires without one. A tracker who cannot be escaped. A shield who cannot be broken. An illusionist who can incapacitate without physical contact. These gifts transform the mathematics of conflict entirely. And Aro, with 3,000 years of touching gifted vampires and reading every thought they have ever had, understands this better than any other being alive. The guard assembled in Volterra across those 3,000 years is not what a randomly assembled group of loyal followers looks like. Loyal followers are uneven. They reflect the accidents of proximity and circumstance and personal history. They have overlapping strengths and significant gaps. They are shaped by chance as much as intention. What the Volterra Guard looks like, examined carefully and honestly, is something assembled with purpose. Each major gift represented within it serves a specific strategic function. Each ability covers a vulnerability that would otherwise exist. The collection, taken as a whole, resembles less a court than a carefully engineered instrument, something designed and refined over a very long time by someone who knew exactly what each piece was for. Designing such an instrument requires knowing not just which vampires happen to have useful gifts. It requires knowing how to find them, how to identify them before they become powerful enough to be dangerous or attached enough to other covens to be unavailable, how to acquire them at the moment when acquisition is still possible, when they are still new enough to the immortal world to be shaped by the structure they enter rather than resistant to it. It requires, in other words, a system, a method of identifying extraordinary potential before it fully manifests, and ensuring that it manifests in Volterra rather than anywhere else. In the hills above Tuscany, the candles have burned in the same halls for 3,000 years. The same three men sit in the same positions. The same laws govern the same world. And the same question has been waiting, patient as stone, for someone to finally ask it. Not whether the Volturi are powerful, not whether their laws serve a purpose, but whether everything they have built, every gifted guard member, every eliminated rival, every carefully enforced law, was ever really about order at all, or whether order was simply the most elegant disguise that power ever found for itself. The answer begins not with the Volturi's history, but with a question about the nature of vampire gifts themselves, about where they come from, about whether they can be predicted, about whether someone who understood them well enough could look at a living human being and see, already present within them, the outline of something extraordinary waiting to be made permanent. Someone has understood this for a very long time, and they have been acting on that understanding quietly and without interruption for 3,000 years. There is a moment somewhere in the 3 days of burning that transform a human being into a vampire when something extraordinary happens. The venom works through the body systematically, rewriting biology at the cellular level, replacing what is mortal and fragile with something designed to last forever. It hardens tissue and sharpens senses and stills the heart. It takes everything that was human and makes it permanent, makes it stronger, makes it other. But occasionally, it does something more. Occasionally, the transformation does not simply amplify the physical. It reaches into something less tangible, into the particular shape of a person's mind, into the specific nature of their perception, into whatever quality made them unusual or extraordinary as a human being. And it amplifies that too. It takes what was subtle and makes it overwhelming. It takes what was instinct and makes it ability. It takes a human trait that might have gone entirely unnoticed by the people around them, or been noticed only as a quirk, a sensitivity, an unusual way of moving through the world, a strangeness that no one could quite name, and it makes it into something that has no equivalent in any human language, because nothing like it has ever existed in the human world before. These are vampire gifts, and for as long as vampires have existed, the question of where they come from has carried a deceptively simple answer. They are random. They are accidents of transformation, emerging without pattern or predictability from the biological chaos of venom rewriting a human body cell by cell. They appear in some vampires and not others for reasons that cannot be anticipated or understood in advance, distributed across the immortal world by nothing more meaningful than chance. This is the answer most vampires accept. It is the answer they have always been given, and there has never been a compelling reason to question it, because the alternative, that gifts follow a pattern, that they can be predicted, that someone who understood them well enough could identify them in living humans before any transformation ever occurred, carries implications that most vampires would find deeply uncomfortable to sit with for very long. It is not, however, entirely true. Carlyle Cullen arrived at a different understanding through decades of careful, patient observation. As a physician who had spent centuries studying both human and vampire biology with equal rigor, who had transformed more people with more deliberate care and more conscious attention to outcome than almost any other vampire alive, he noticed something that a less attentive observer would have dismissed as coincidence, or perhaps never noticed at all. The vampires who developed gifts after transformation were not random selections from the broad population of the transformed. They were not evenly distributed across all the humans who had ever been turned, appearing without preference or pattern among the cautious and the reckless, the intelligent and the ordinary, the psychologically complex and the straightforward. They were, without exception, when examined closely enough, people who had already possessed something unusual as humans. Not supernatural ability, nothing so dramatic or immediately obvious, but a quality, a particular intensity of perception, or an unusual depth of emotional awareness, or a psychological characteristic so pronounced and so defining that it colored everything they did and everything they were long before any vampire ever touched them. The transformation did not create their gifts. It revealed them. It took what was already present in the deepest architecture of who they were and built it into something permanent and vast, something that could not be contained by the ordinary limitations of human biology, and so had never been able to fully express itself until those limitations were removed. This distinction between gifts that are created by transformation and gifts that are uncovered by it changes everything about how vampire abilities must be understood. If gifts are random, they cannot be predicted or sought. They simply appear, and the vampire world receives them as they come, with gratitude or fear, depending on circumstance. But if gifts are the amplification of pre-existing human traits, if they are the completion of something that was already there, waiting, constrained only by the imperfect machinery of mortal life, then they can be identified before transformation ever occurs. A person who already possesses the relevant human quality, whatever form it takes, can be recognized, can be assessed, can be selected at the optimal moment, under the optimal circumstances, and transformed into exactly the kind of vampire that a patient and knowledgeable architect might require. The evidence for this principle is not theoretical. It is written in the specific histories of nearly every gifted vampire the saga documents, and it bears examination slowly and carefully one life at a time, because the pattern that emerges when those histories are placed side by side is not the kind that can be easily dismissed. Edward Mason was 17 years old and dying of influenza in a crowded Chicago hospital in 1918 when Carlyle transformed him. He was the son of a lawyer, a boy who had grown up in a household defined by careful argument and precise observation, and he had absorbed those qualities in ways that went considerably beyond what his upbringing alone could explain. As a human, Edward had been remarkable for his perceptiveness, his ability to read people with an accuracy that went beyond ordinary social intelligence, beyond even the kind of heightened awareness that comes from a difficult childhood or an unusually demanding environment. He observed the humans around him with a depth of attention that most people never develop and would not know how to sustain if they tried. Tracking the small inconsistencies between what people said and what they actually meant, between the emotions they chose to display and the ones they were genuinely experiencing beneath the performance. He was the kind of person who understood a room before anyone in it had spoken, who could follow the invisible currents of tension and affection and concealed intention that move through every human gathering, currents that most people navigate by instinct without ever consciously perceiving them. As a vampire, this quality became literal in a way that no human framework could have predicted or prepared him for. What had been careful, deeply attentive human observation, an interpretive act requiring attention and effort and the constant possibility of being wrong, became the direct ability to hear thoughts. The gap between signal and interpretation closed entirely. The work Edward had done as a human, reading the secondary evidence of inner life because the inner life itself was inaccessible, became unnecessary because the source material was now directly available to him. His gift did not give him something he had never possessed. It gave him the same thing he had always possessed, stripped of every barrier that had previously made it imperfect and incomplete. The transformation simply finished what had already been there. Alice's history is, in some ways, the most striking case of all, because her gift presents evidence that is impossible to explain away and impossible to misread. Alice Brandon experienced visions as a human, not metaphorically, not as the kind of intuitive foresight that perceptive people sometimes describe as a sixth sense. Literal visions, fragmentary, disorienting, and impossible to explain within any framework her community possessed, but real, concrete, specific enough to be disturbing to the people around her, real enough that the people responsible for her care found them not merely puzzling, but threatening. Threatening enough that she was eventually institutionalized, placed in an asylum in the early years of the 20th century, where her visions were interpreted as symptoms of mental illness that needed to be managed and suppressed rather than what they actually were, which was a capacity for perception that exceeded anything the human nervous system was designed to accommodate. She spent years in that institution, isolated, subjected to treatments that were the medical consensus of their era and that did nothing whatsoever to alter what she experienced, because what she experienced was not a pathology. It was a gift operating in a body not yet built to hold it properly. When she was eventually transformed, under circumstances that remain partially unclear, the early years of her vampire life and the full history of her human one largely lost to her. Her visions did not appear as something new. They did not emerge as a fresh ability granted by the transformation. They clarified. The fragmented, chronologically unstable, unreliable glimpses she had struggled to interpret as a human became a coherent, extraordinarily accurate precognitive sight. Visions of the future tied directly to the decisions being made in the present, shifting and updating as choices changed, providing information with a reliability that made Alice arguably the single most strategically valuable gifted vampire in the documented history of the immortal world. The fundamental capacity was unchanged from what she had carried as a human. Only its precision, its range, and its reliability were transformed along with everything else about her into something beyond the reach of human limitation. Alice's case is the clearest possible evidence that transformation amplifies rather than invents, because in her case, the original signal was already strong enough to be visible. Visible enough, in fact, to get her locked in an asylum. Long before any amplification occurred, Jasper Whitlock was a soldier. He rose to the rank of major in the Confederate Army during the American Civil War at an age that should not have been sufficient for that rank, achieving it through a combination of tactical intelligence and something harder to quantify. A quality of leadership that went beyond competence or courage. He could feel what the men around him felt, not as metaphor, not as the ordinary empathy that experienced commanders develop through long exposure to men under pressure, but with a directness and an accuracy that those who served under him sometimes described in terms that stopped just short of the supernatural. He knew when morale was failing before it appeared in anyone's face or behavior. He understood the emotional texture of a unit, its fear, its resolve, its fracture points, the particular shape of its collective psychological state at any given moment, with an intimacy that allowed him to intervene at exactly the right moment, to say exactly the right thing, to make decisions about deployment and rest and engagement that reflected not just military logic, but a reading of human emotional reality so precise it bordered on the uncanny. As a vampire, this sensitivity became the ability to both feel and manipulate the emotions of everyone within his range. The receiving capacity he had possessed as a human, which had always been passive, something that happened to him, information that arrived without his seeking it, became active as well. He could send emotion outward as readily as he received it, projecting calm into a panicking room, amplifying courage or despair or contentment in the people around him, shaping the emotional experience of everyone present with the same directness and accuracy with which he had once simply read it. The transformation gave his gift its other direction, completing a circuit that had always been capable of transmission, but had previously only been able to receive. What was already there was not replaced. It was finished. Bella Swan presents a case that is at once simpler in its mechanics and more profound in its implications than any of the others, because Bella's gift requires no transformation to be observed. It was visible, unmistakably, inexplicably visible, from the very first moment Edward Cullen encountered her as a living human being sitting beside him in a biology classroom in the small rainy town of Forks, Washington. As a human, Bella was private, in a way that went far below the surface of ordinary social reserve. Not in the familiar sense of someone who keeps certain things to themselves by choice, who maintains boundaries and guards their inner life through conscious effort. Something more fundamental than that. Her internal world was genuinely, structurally closed in ways she herself did not fully understand and had not chosen. She did not broadcast her emotions with the legibility that most people do without realizing it. The micro-expressions, the shifts in posture and breathing and eye movement, the 1,000 unconscious signals through which human beings constantly transmit their inner experience to anyone paying sufficient attention. She was consistently difficult to read, consistently surprising even to people who knew her well and had known her for years. Consistently, the person in any room whose inner experience was least accessible to the people around her, not because she was deceptive, but because the natural transparency that most humans possess without thinking about it was simply absent in her. Edward could not read her thoughts from the first moment he encountered her, and the significance of that silence cannot be overstated. He had spent nearly a century hearing every mind around him in an unbroken stream. Every human, every vampire, everyone in every room he had ever entered, the thoughts pressing in constantly, unavoidable, exhausting in their relentlessness. Every other human in the biology classroom that day was fully audible to him. Every student in the school, every teacher, every person in Forks who came within range. Only Bella was silent. Only Bella's mind was simply and completely and inexplicably absent from the constant noise of everyone else's consciousness. This was not a vampire limitation specific to her nature, because she was entirely human. It was not an artifact of distance or distraction or some failure of his concentration. It was a property of her mind itself, doing what it had apparently always done, simply and without effort, completely and without exception. The shield that would later prove powerful enough to protect an entire assembled coven of vampires against the most devastating offensive gifts the Volturi possessed, against Jane's ability to create the illusion of unbearable pain, against Alec's ability to remove all sensation and leave a vampire helpless and directionless, against the full offensive arsenal of the most powerful guard ever assembled, was already present and already functioning in a Forks high school, in the living human girl who had no idea it existed. It was simply a human trait, expressed at a level so extraordinary that it was already doing something no human trait should have been able to do. And when transformation completed it, it became something for which even Aro, with 3,000 years of experience cataloguing gifts, had no adequate comparison. The pattern that emerges from these histories, examined honestly and without the prior assumption that gifts are random, is not subtle. It is not ambiguous. It does not require interpretive generosity to perceive. It is consistent across every documented case to a degree that makes coincidence not merely unlikely, but structurally impossible as an explanation. In every case, the gift that manifests after transformation is a direct, logical, and recognizable extension of who that person already was as a human being. The transformation does not introduce qualities that were absent. It removes limitations that were preventing existing qualities from fully expressing themselves. It takes the particular shape of a human mind, its specific architecture, its characteristic modes of perception and response, its defining psychological qualities, and makes that shape permanent and complete and operating at a scale the original biological substrate could never have supported. This means something that should be deeply unsettling to anyone who thinks carefully about it for long enough. It means that a person with sufficient knowledge of this principle, with enough experience applying it across enough individual cases to understand its mechanics with real precision, could examine a living human being and make a meaningful, directional, genuinely predictive assessment of what kind of vampire that person would become. Not a perfect prediction. The relationship between human trait and vampire gift is not a simple formula, and the transformation involves complexities that resist complete systematization, but a meaningful one. Accurate enough to distinguish reliably between a human who would transform into an ordinary vampire, however capable, and a human who would transform into something extraordinary. Accurate enough, in other words, to make selection not just possible, but practical. And selection changes everything. Random gifts distributed across the vampire world by the accidents of who happens to be transformed, by whom, under what circumstances, are a resource that cannot be managed. They appear where they appear. They belong to whoever turns the person who carries them. They cannot be reliably acquired or strategically positioned, but gifts that can be anticipated, that are already visible in their human form, already present as traits and tendencies and unusual psychological qualities, waiting only for the right transformation to complete them, are something entirely different. They are a resource that can be identified in advance, pursued deliberately, acquired at the most advantageous moment, and positioned within an existing structure to serve specific and carefully considered purposes. The question of who first understood this principle is not difficult to answer. The question of how long they have been acting on it, and how deliberately, and with what degree of patience and foresight, is considerably harder to sit with once it fully arrives. Because if vampire gifts are not random, if they are the predictable completion of recognizable human qualities, then 3,000 years of Volturi history looks entirely different than it did before. Every gifted vampire in Volterra becomes evidence of something that was never governance. It was always engineering. To understand Aro, it helps to begin with his gift, because his gift is not incidental to who he is. It is the foundation of everything he has become across 3,000 years of immortal life, the instrument through which he has accumulated more knowledge about the vampire world than any other being alive, and the lens through which every interaction he has ever had must ultimately be understood. Other vampires have gifts that are powerful in the moment of their application, gifts that can incapacitate or track or shield or manipulate. Aro's gift does something different. It accumulates, it builds. Every mind he has ever touched has added to an archive of knowledge so vast and so detailed that it constitutes, after 3,000 years, something that has no real equivalent anywhere in the human or the vampire world. It is not just a gift. It is an institution. Aro can read minds through touch, not the way Edward reads minds. Passively, continuously, the thoughts of those around him arriving whether he seeks them or not. A constant stream he cannot shut off, and has spent a century learning to manage. Aro's gift requires physical contact, a single touch, and what it gives him is not just the present thought, but the entire history of a person's consciousness. Every memory, every decision, every moment of clarity and confusion and doubt and certainty that person has ever experienced, from their earliest formed recollections to the present moment of contact. A single handshake with Aro is, from his perspective, a complete biography, There is nothing a person has ever thought that he cannot access in that moment of contact. No secret too deeply buried, no memory too old or too carefully concealed to be beyond his reach. He does not read what people choose to show him. He reads everything. Every version of every thought a person has ever entertained, including the ones they would most wish to have back. 3,000 years of touching people. Sit with that for a moment and consider what it actually means in practice. 3,000 years of reading complete minds, of absorbing total histories, of accumulating not just information but understanding. The kind of deep, structural understanding of how minds work and what they reveal about the people who carry them that can only come from an extraordinarily vast and varied sample. Aro has touched more minds than any human institution has ever formally studied. He has read the complete inner histories of vampires who were themselves centuries old at the time of contact, giving him access not just to their own memories, but to the memories of every significant person those vampires had known intimately, an exponentially expanding archive of knowledge about the immortal world and the humans who move through it, that compounds with every passing century, every new contact, every new biography absorbed through the medium of touch. He does not merely know more than other vampires. He knows more than other vampires in a way that is categorically different, that operates at a different order of magnitude, that makes the knowledge of even very old and very experienced vampires look like isolated data points against the context of everything he carries. Within that archive, one pattern would have become visible very early and would have grown more legible and more certain with every passing century. The pattern that Carlyle identified through decades of careful medical observation, that vampire gifts are the amplification of pre-existing human traits. Aro would have confirmed through direct and total access to the complete life histories of every gifted vampire he had ever encountered. He would not have needed to theorize. He would not have needed to observe from the outside and draw inferences from incomplete evidence. He would have been able to trace the lineage of every gift directly, reading in each gifted vampire's memories the human life that preceded the transformation, seeing with perfect and unambiguous clarity the trait that became the ability, the quality that became the power, the particular shape of a human mind that the transformation had taken and made absolute and permanent and vast. He has known this, in other words, with the certainty of direct evidence rather than inference, for a very long time, longer, almost certainly, than any other vampire alive, because no other vampire has had the mechanism to confirm it so definitively. And the question that follows from that knowledge, the question that would have presented itself to a mind as precise and as patient and as fundamentally acquisitive as Aro's within the first few centuries of accumulating this understanding, is not a complicated one. It does not require great leaps of imagination or ambition to arrive at. It presents itself with the quiet inevitability of a logical conclusion. If you can read the gift in the human before the transformation occurs, why would you ever wait for transformation to happen by accident? Aro's documented behavior across the saga, examined through this lens and with this question held consistently in mind, becomes something considerably more coherent than the erratic enthusiasm of an eccentric collector with refined tastes and an unusual hobby. It becomes the visible surface of a system, a methodology for identification and acquisition that has been refined across 3,000 years into something that operates with the smoothness and the patience of a process so well established that it no longer requires conscious deliberation at every step. It simply runs, because the structures that support it have long since been built into the fabric of how the Volturi engage with the world beyond Volterra's walls. The recruitment behavior is the most immediately visible evidence, and it is worth examining not just as a pattern, but in its specific documented instances. Aro does not merely accept gifted vampires who present themselves voluntarily and request a place in the guard. He pursues them. He extends invitations that carry the unmistakable weight of expectations rather than the genuine openness of offers. He creates circumstances through the leverage of law, through the implicit presence of consequence, through the careful management of what alternatives appear to be available, in which the path toward Volterra is made smooth and the paths away from it are made costly. Edward and Alice are offered places in the guard during the confrontation in Volterra that follows Bella's near exposure in Italy, in the events that constitute the climax of the second chapter of the saga. The offer is, framed in Aro's characteristic language of admiration and opportunity, and the generous recognition of extraordinary ability, but it is not, in any meaningful sense, a free offer. It is the opening position of a negotiation that Aro fully intends to win, if not immediately, then eventually, because Aro does not measure time the way most beings do. He has 3,000 years of practice at the particular art of waiting for the right moment, and he is very good at it. The emotional register of Aro's reactions to gifted vampires is itself one of the most telling details in his documented behavior, because those reactions are disproportionate in ways that reveal, with uncomfortable clarity, what he actually values and what leaves him genuinely unmoved. When Aro encounters a vampire with an extraordinary gift, something shifts in him that is visibly and qualitatively different from his response to almost anything else. He becomes animated in a manner that his usual careful, ceremonial composure does not otherwise permit. The deliberate stillness of someone who has had 3,000 years to learn how to present himself falls away, replaced by an eagerness that is almost childlike in its immediacy, almost helpless in its transparency. He reaches for their hand with an urgency that bypasses the ritualized restraint he applies to nearly every other interaction, seeking contact, seeking access, seeking the complete confirmation of what his other senses are already telling him about the gift he is in the presence of. Edward notices this in Volterra, and it unsettles him, not because Aro's admiration seems false, but because it seems too genuine, too immediate, too specifically calibrated to the ability rather than to the individual who carries it. Aro does not respond to Edward as a complex person, whose century of experience, whose internal moral struggle, whose genuine and hard-won philosophical development across more than 90 years of choosing a different kind of existence might warrant sustained and meaningful interest. He responds to Edward as a remarkable specimen of something he has been cataloguing for a very long time, a particularly fine example of a category he knows well, an expression of the mind-reading gift at a level of sensitivity and range that exceeds most instances he has previously encountered. The person is almost incidental to the power. The biography is interesting primarily as context for understanding how the ability developed and what might be done with it in more favorable circumstances. This is the pattern. When Jane causes pain, when Alec removes sensation, when Dimitri tracks a mental signature across an entire continent without losing a single thread, Aro watches with the particular settled satisfaction of someone observing the reliable operation of something they built and have long since come to take for granted. When actual threats to governance arise, when genuine crises of exposure or rebellion demand his attention, his response is measured and strategic and almost entirely unemotional. The response of someone for whom power is a management problem rather than a source of excitement. The passion is reserved for the gifts. The cold, strategic intelligence is reserved for everything else. And the combination of those two things, genuine, passionate investment in the collection of abilities, and cold, strategic intelligence governing how that collection is protected and expanded, describes someone whose fundamental project has never been governance at all. Governance is the framework within which the actual project operates. It is the justification, the structure, the publicly stated purpose. But the actual project is something older and more specific, and considerably harder to justify in the language of order and law. The laws themselves, examined carefully for their secondary functions, reveal this most completely. The exposure law, as noted, requires that any human who learns about vampire existence must be either killed or transformed. The stated purpose is protective, and the protection is real. A human who knows about vampires and is left alive and free represents a genuine secrecy risk. The Volturi's entire structure depends on managing. But the operational consequence of this law is equally real and considerably less discussed. Every human who learns about vampires and is subsequently transformed does not disappear into the broad anonymity of an immortal world too large to monitor. They become a new vampire with a documented history of contact with the vampire world, a specific creator, a set of known circumstances, all of which are exactly the kind of information the Volturi are positioned to collect and act upon. If that new vampire proves to be gifted, if the transformation reveals something extraordinary, as it occasionally does, the Volturi are in a position to know about it almost immediately. And knowing about it leads, with considerable regularity in the historical record, to an invitation. The Immortal Children Prohibition carries its own secondary architecture. The absolute ban on transforming human children is enforced, as documented across the saga's account of historical Volturi action, with a thoroughness that extends well beyond the individual offense. It eliminates not just the creator of the child, but typically the coven surrounding them, the witnesses to the child's existence, anyone whose knowledge of the situation represents a thread that might require management later. This thoroughness has the cumulative effect, whether designed or simply convenient, and after 3,000 years of consistent application, the distinction becomes genuinely difficult to maintain. Of periodically removing established mature covens that might otherwise grow into powers capable of independent development. Every coven destroyed under the Immortal Children. Prohibition is a coven that will never produce its own gifted vampires outside Volturi awareness. Every group of vampires eliminated for harboring a transformed child is a group that will not live long enough to become the kind of alternative power structure that might offer extraordinary individuals somewhere to belong other than Volterra. The pattern of coven elimination that precedes and surrounds the formalization of Volturi authority, the systematic removal of rivals that left the Romanian coven as the only surviving alternative, carries the same logic forward into the era of formal governance. The Volturi do not need to hunt powerful independent covens once the laws are in place to provide justification for eliminating them when they become inconvenient. The laws generate their own enforcement opportunities, and enforcement, applied consistently across 3,000 years, produces a landscape in which extraordinary gifted vampires have very few places to exist that are genuinely outside the Volturi's gravitational pull. Aro's response to Bella Swan is worth examining at particular length, because it represents something the system was apparently not entirely designed to handle. A case that arrived through channels Aro did not control, in circumstances he had not arranged, attached to a coven he could not simply absorb, expressing a gift at a level that even his vast experience had not prepared him to encounter. When Aro makes contact with Bella's hand in the throne room in Volterra, when he completes the touch and finds the silence where a complete inner history should be, his reaction is immediate, unconcealed, and qualitatively different from nearly anything else his documented behavior records. It is not frustration at being denied information he wanted. It is not the professional assessment of a limitation to be worked around. It is wonder, genuine, almost unguarded wonder at encountering something for which his 3,000 years of accumulated experience provides no adequate reference point. He has touched countless minds. He has read the complete histories of vampires who were themselves ancient when the world was young. He has encountered every variety of gift that the documented vampire world has produced, catalogued and understood and filed away in the vast archive of everything his gift has ever given him access to. And Bella's silence is unlike anything in that archive. Not a weak shield, not a partial resistance, not the kind of limited mental privacy that a few vampires have demonstrated across the centuries. Nothing. Complete, effortless, apparently unconscious nothing in a living human girl who does not even know she is doing it. He describes her, still in that first encounter, as one of the most extraordinary individuals he has encountered across his entire existence. He extends an invitation in the same breath, with the same urgency that characterizes his approach to every gifted being he has ever wanted to add to his collection. And when she leaves Volterra still, human, still belonging to the Cullen Coven rather than to Volterra, the invitation does not expire or diminish. It simply waits, filed in the same patient strategic archive as every other long-term position Aro has ever taken, for circumstances to develop in a direction that makes acquisition more feasible. What Aro recognized in Bella in that moment of silent contact was not merely an unusual human with an interesting psychological characteristic. It was the confirmation of something his gift recognition system had perhaps never encountered at quite this level of clarity. A gift already operating fully and without effort or awareness in a living human body that should not have been able to sustain it. The shield that would eventually prove capable of covering an entire assembled coven against the Volturi's full offensive arsenal was already present and already functioning in a high school student in a small rainy town in the Pacific Northwest. the human version was already doing something no human trait should have been able to do. And Aro, who had spent 3,000 years learning to read exactly this kind of pre-transformation signal, who had built an entire system around the ability to identify extraordinary potential before transformation completed it, understood immediately and completely what it meant, what she would become if transformed, what that gift would represent at its full vampire expression, what it would mean strategically to have a shield of that scope operating in service of the guard rather than, as it eventually did, in direct opposition to it. He understood all of this in the moment of contact, or the moment of its absence, and the understanding produced in him an urgency that his usual composure could not entirely contain. The portrait that assembles itself from all of this, from the gift and what 3,000 years of applying it has produced, from the recruitment behavior and its specific documented instances, from the emotional register of his responses to extraordinary ability, from the secondary architecture of the laws he enforces, from his reaction to Bella, is not the portrait of an eccentric king who happens to find gifted vampires interesting. It is the portrait of someone who has been running the same fundamental project for 3,000 years, who has refined it across those years into something approaching a science, who has built the structures of vampire governance partly as a genuine response to a genuine need, and partly as the most effective possible framework within which to continue that project without interference. Aro is the most knowledgeable being in the vampire world on the subject of how gifts work, where they come from, and how to recognize them before they are fully formed. He has had both the motivation and the means and the extraordinary patience to act on that knowledge in a sustained and systematic way across the whole of recorded vampire history, and the guard that surrounds him in Volturi, its composition, its specific abilities, the strategic architecture of what those abilities cover and protect and prevent, is the most visible evidence of what 3,000 years of that project looks like when it has been allowed to run without meaningful interruption. It does not look like an accident. It does not look like a collection. It looks like something that was designed. There is a village in England, somewhere in the early years of the 15th century, where two children are growing up in circumstances that would eventually lead to a throne room in Volturi, and the most devastating offensive weapons the vampire world has ever produced. The village does not survive in any historical record worth consulting. The children's family name has not been preserved. What has been preserved, passed down through the specific and reliable memory of vampires who do not forget, is the outline of what those two children were before Aro found them, and what they became after he did, and the deeply uncomfortable question of whether any meaningful distinction exists between those two things. Jane and Alec were twins. They lived together, thought together, moved through their world with a particular coherence of two people who have never known a moment of genuine psychological separation. The twin bond in ordinary human siblings is a matter of shared history and mutual understanding, the closeness that comes from having occupied the same space from the very beginning of conscious life. In Jane and Alec, it was something more than that, something that the people around them noticed and could not entirely account for, and did not, ultimately, know what to do with. They were too aware of each other, too responsive to each other's states, too present to each other in ways that seemed to operate below the threshold of ordinary communication, below language and gesture, and the normal signals through which people transmit their inner experience to those around them. The village noticed other things as well. There are two versions of how that noticing eventually expressed itself, and they are not entirely inconsistent with each other. In one version, the children simply had an unsettling effect on the people around them. Things happened near Jane and Alec that could not be explained. Small disturbances in the ordinary texture of daily life that accumulated over years into a reputation neither child had sought and neither could entirely dispel. People who angered Jane experienced pain that had no visible source and no medical explanation. People who came too close to Alec in the wrong circumstances found themselves confused and directionless in ways that cleared immediately once distance was restored. These were not dramatic events. They were quiet ones, the kind that are easy to dismiss individually and difficult to dismiss collectively over years of accumulation. In the other version, or perhaps simply the same version made more legible by the passage of time, the village decided, in the way that frightened communities have always eventually decided about people they cannot explain, that the children were witches. The word carried specific and lethal weight in 15th century England. It was not an accusation that invited investigation or nuance or the careful weighing of evidence. It was a conclusion, and conclusions of that kind in that era had a specific and well-established consequence. They were going to be burned. This is canon. This is not interpretation or extrapolation or the filling of narrative gaps with plausible invention. Aro himself confirms in the account the saga preserves of Jane and Alec's history that he found them at the moment of their execution, that they were already bound, already at the stake, already in the process of being destroyed by a community that had decided their existence was incompatible with the safety of everything around them. The fire had begun. The burning had started. Aro arrived, as he apparently so often does, at exactly the right moment, which is to say, at the last possible moment at which intervention could still produce a useful outcome, and not a moment before. He saved them. He intervened, and he transformed them, and he brought them to Volterra, and Jane and Alec became the Volturi Guard's most feared members. The weapons that make the Guard not merely powerful, but essentially unapproachable by any force that does not possess an equally extraordinary defensive capability. Jane's gift, the ability to create the perfect and overwhelming illusion of pain in any target she focuses on. Burning agony that bypasses the physical body entirely and operates directly on the mind, makes her capable of incapacitating any vampire, regardless of size or age or physical strength, in an instant. Alec's gift, the ability to sever all sensory connection between a person's mind and their body, removing sight and hearing and touch, and the awareness of physical existence entirely, leaving the mind intact but the body completely inaccessible to it, is, if anything, even more devastating in its strategic implications. A vampire under Alec's gift cannot fight, cannot flee, cannot do anything at all except exist in perfect sensory isolation, while the world acts upon them without their participation. Together, in the context of the Volturi's confrontational methodology, they represent a capability that makes meaningful resistance almost impossible. Jane can take down individual targets of any power level before they can respond. Alec can take down entire groups simultaneously, removing a field of opponents from the battle before it begins. The combination, applied in the way the Volturi's Breaking Dawn confrontation demonstrates, is designed to make the superior numbers and physical capability of any opposing force entirely irrelevant. It does not matter how strong or how numerous your allies are if Alec has already removed their ability to act. This is what emerged from two children in a 15th century English village, and the question that the script's central argument demands be asked here is not a comfortable one. It is the question of how much Aro knew, and when, and what he did with that knowledge before the moment he appeared at the burning stake. The Volturi are ancient. They have existed in their current form and with their current reach for 3,000 years. Their network of awareness, the information they gather through the movement of the guard, through vampires who travel and report, through the simple mathematical advantage of having more eyes and more centuries of accumulated intelligence about the world than any competing power, is not small. It is not limited to the immediate vicinity of Volterra or to the interactions Aro personally initiates. It is broad and deep and has had 3,000 years to develop its reach into every corner of the immortal world and a considerable portion of the human one. The idea that Aro would have had no awareness of Jane and Alec before the moment of their near execution is, in this context, difficult to sustain. Not impossible, but difficult. The children had been behaving in ways that attracted communal attention for years before the accusation of witchcraft formally crystallized. The reputation that eventually got them condemned was not the product of a single incident, but of an extended accumulation of unexplained events. The kind of accumulation that tends to generate exactly the kind of local conversation and local anxiety that makes its way, eventually, into the awareness of anyone paying sufficient attention to the regions they monitor. And Aro pays sufficient attention. That is, in many ways, the most consistent and defining thing about him. He pays attention with extraordinary resources, extraordinary patience, and a clarity of purpose about what he is looking for that makes him very unlikely to miss something as significant as two children, displaying what amounts to pre-transformation vampire gifts in a small English village. The question then is not whether Aro knew. The more disturbing question, the one the evidence points toward and refuses to step back from, is what Aro did with that knowledge in the years between becoming aware of Jane and Alec and the moment he arrived at their burning. He waited. He knew they were there. He understood what they were, what that level of psychological intensity, that depth of the twin bond, that quality of effect on the people around them almost certainly indicated about what they would become if transformed. He had touched enough minds, read enough histories, accumulated enough direct evidence of the relationship between human trait and vampire gift to make a meaningful assessment of Jane and Alec's potential long before any formal accusation was made against them. He could see, with the particular clarity his gift and his experience gave him, what those two children would be worth, and he allowed the circumstances around them to develop, allowed the communal anxiety to build, allowed the reputation to accumulate and harden into accusation, an accusation to harden into condemnation, allowed the fire to be prepared and the execution to be arranged and the burning to begin. And then he arrived. Why does the timing matter? Why does it matter that Aro intervened at the last possible moment rather than earlier, rather than finding them before the accusation and removing them from danger before they had to experience what they experienced because of what they became. Jane inflicts the illusion of pain, burning pain, not coincidentally, not as some random expression of her offensive capability, but specifically the sensation of burning, the experience of being consumed by fire, the agony that was in the process of killing her at the moment Aro chose to intervene. The worst thing that had ever happened to her became the weapon she carries for eternity, the most extreme experience of her human life, the one that was ending her, the one she was living through in the full extremity of its terror and agony when the venom entered her system and the transformation began. That experience is what her gift is made of. It is what she gives to others. It is the specific form her power took because it was the dominant experience of her transformation, the thing her mind was saturated with as the venom rewrote her. Alec's gift is the removal of sensation entirely, the complete severing of the mind from the body's sensory experience, the absolute numbing that leaves a person present but unreachable, in a human facing burning, facing unbearable pain, facing the complete failure of everything that protected them from the world. There is a psychological response that the mind sometimes produces as a survival mechanism. A shutting down, a withdrawal from the unbearable into a place of internal distance where the experience cannot reach with its full force. Alec's gift is that response, made absolute and externally applicable. It is what a mind under extreme threat reaches for. The removal of sensation as protection, transformed by the venom into the ability to impose that removal on others. Their gifts did not emerge arbitrarily from the chaos of transformation. They emerged from the specific psychological and emotional content of what they were experiencing when transformation occurred. The venom amplified not just their traits, but the state they were in, the extremity of the experience, the particular quality of what their minds were doing under the worst circumstances they had ever encountered, and made it permanent and vast and weaponized, which means that the specific form their gifts took was shaped by the specific circumstances of their transformation, and the specific circumstances of their transformation, burning at the stake in the extremity of a public execution, were circumstances that Aro allowed to develop to their full expression before he intervened. There is no way to know with certainty whether Aro understood this mechanism precisely enough to have engineered the outcome deliberately, whether he knew before the fact that intervening at the moment of burning would produce gifts of this specific and devastating character, or whether the discovery of what Jane and Alec became was something that even his vast experience had not fully predicted. He is not the kind of being who leaves clear records of his reasoning. He is the kind of being whose reasoning can only be inferred from the consistency of the outcomes he achieves across 3,000 years of acting in the world. But the outcomes are what they are, and the consistency with which the outcomes align with what a patient, knowledgeable architect would have designed if they understood the relationship between transformation circumstances and gift expression, is a consistency that requires explanation. Jane and Alec arrived in Volturi as the most psychologically devastated pair of individuals imaginable. Twins who had been condemned together, burned together, saved at the last possible moment by the same hand, brought into the same new existence in the same breath. Their bond, already extraordinary as humans, was made absolute by the shared extremity of what they had survived. Their loyalty to Aro, the being who had reaped them through the fire and given them survival when everything else had abandoned them, was not manufactured by Chelsea's gift, though Chelsea's gift certainly maintained it. It was organic, rooted in the most foundational experience of their vampire lives. Aro had saved them. Everything that came before him was pain and rejection and burning. Everything that came after him was power beyond anything their human selves could have imagined. That is a loyalty that does not require maintenance. That is a loyalty that was built into the foundation of who they became, because who they became began at the moment Aro chose to intervene. In Volterra, Jane and Alec are the weapons around which the Guard's offensive capability is organized. Other gifted members contribute tracking, loyalty management, physical protection, sensory enhancement. But Jane and Alec are the ones whose abilities make the Volturi genuinely unapproachable as a military force. The ones whose presence in a confrontation changes the mathematics of opposition so completely that resistance becomes, in most circumstances, simply irrational. They are the feature of the Volturi's power structure that no rival coven has ever found an adequate answer to, until Bellaswan's shield, fully expressed as a vampire ability, proved capable of holding Jane's illusions at bay and protecting those behind it from Alec's sensory severance. That the one thing capable of neutralizing the Volturi's two most devastating weapons turned out to be a gift that Aro desperately wanted for his own collection, residing in a vampire who belonged to the coven most willing to stand against him, is one of the more elegant ironies the saga produces. But Jane and Alec themselves remain beneath the irony and the analysis, something that deserves to be held in mind as more than strategic assets or evidence for a theory. They were children. They were twins who had something extraordinary in them that the world they were born into could not accommodate and move to destroy. They burned. And in the burning, or more precisely in the timing of their rescue from the burning, they became what Aro needed them to be. Whether or not he planned it to the precise degree the evidence suggests, the outcome served him perfectly. That is the detail across all of this that is most difficult to set aside. Not the gifts themselves, extraordinary as they are. Not the loyalty, absolute as it has proven, but the perfection of the fit between what Aro needed and what Jane and Alec became, and the circumstances under which they became it. That reads less like fortune than like 3,000 years of patience applied to a very specific and very long-term objective. Begin with a thought experiment. Imagine you are tasked with designing the perfect governing body for a secret society of immortal predators. Your design must accomplish several specific things simultaneously. It must be able to locate any vampire anywhere in the world who attempts to flee Volturi authority, because a governing body that cannot find those who defy it cannot govern. It must be able to neutralize any opposition it encounters regardless of that opposition's physical strength or numerical advantage, because a governing body that can be defeated by sufficiently determined resistance is not truly a governing body at all. It must be able to manage the loyalty of its own members across centuries of proximity and potential disillusionment, because immortal beings who live long enough will eventually begin to question the arrangements they exist within, and questioning loyalty is the first step toward broken loyalty. It must protect its leadership from physical harm, because the loss of key individuals would destabilize the entire structure, and it must be able to maintain the contentment of those who live within its walls without constant active management, because active management of hundreds of beings across thousands of years would eventually exceed the capacity of even the most attentive administration. Now look at the Volturi Guard as it actually exists, and notice how completely it satisfies each of those requirements. Dimitri tracks, Chelsea manages loyalty, Renata protects, Jane and Alec neutralize opposition, Corin maintains contentment. Each function that the perfect governing body would require has a corresponding gift in Volterra, and each gift is expressed at a level of power and reliability that makes it genuinely effective rather than merely useful in favorable circumstances. The coverage is not partial. It is not the result of making do with whatever was available. It is comprehensive in a way that design produces and accident does not. This is the Guard, and it deserves to be examined not as a collection of interesting individuals, but as a system, understood in terms of what each of its components does and why the specific combination of those components produces something qualitatively different from what any subset of them could achieve alone. Dimitri is the Volturi's tracker, and his gift operates on a principle that sets him apart from every other tracker the vampire world has documented. Most trackers follow physical traces, scent, heat, the biological evidence that a body leaves in the physical environment as it passes through. These are powerful gifts, capable of following prey across significant distances and through deliberate attempts at concealment. James, the tracker who hunts Bella in the first volume of the saga, represents this category at a high level of expression, persistent, methodical, very difficult to lose through ordinary evasion. Dimitri operates differently. He tracks the tenor of a mind, the particular quality of a person's consciousness, its characteristic texture, its individual signature, the specific way that particular mind feels when it is in the world, is what Dimitri locks onto. And once he has made that lock, no physical distance and no physical concealment can break it. You cannot disguise a scent from Dimitri because he is not following a scent. You cannot change your appearance or your route or your method of travel and lose him, because none of those things change the fundamental quality of the mind he is tracking. The only way to become invisible to Dimitri is to become mentally invisible, to somehow alter or block the signal that your consciousness broadcasts simply by existing. The strategic implications of this are enormous, and it is worth sitting with them fully. The Volturi do not merely have the ability to pursue those who defy their authority. They have the ability to pursue them anywhere, across any distance, indefinitely, with a mechanism that cannot be defeated by any ordinary means of evasion. The vampire world knows this. Every vampire who considers defiance of the Volturi must contend not just with the possibility of pursuit, but with the near certainty of it, conducted by a tracker whose gift makes successful escape essentially impossible, unless the defiant party happens to possess or have access to something capable of blocking Dimitri's mental log. Aro, with his complete access to Dimitri's memories and the full history of his gift's development and application, understands this capability in its precise detail, and the effect of that understanding on the behavior of the broader vampire world, the way Dimitri's mere existence as a guard member shapes the calculations of every vampire who might otherwise consider testing the boundaries of Volturi authority, is itself a form of governance that requires no active deployment. Dmitri does not need to track anyone in order for his gift to be doing its work. His known presence in Volterra is sufficient. The awareness that escape is essentially impossible, not as a boast or a threat, but as a documented operational reality, is a deterrent that functions continuously and without resource expenditure. Chelsea's gift is, in many ways, the most important in the Guard, and also the most uncomfortable to examine directly, because what Chelsea does touches something that most people, human or vampire, prefer to believe is beyond external manipulation. She alters emotional bonds. She can strengthen the ties that bind a person to a group, deepening loyalty and affection and sense of belonging, until those feelings become effectively unquestionable. And she can weaken or dissolve the ties that connect a person to anyone outside the Volturi structure, gradually eroding the attachments that might otherwise pull a Guard member's loyalty in a competing direction. This is canon. Jasper identifies it during the preparations for the Breaking Dawn confrontation, noting that without Chelsea's influence actively maintaining the emotional architecture of the Guard, many of its members might not remain as committed to their positions as they appear. The loyalty that holds the Volturi structure together, the loyalty that makes the Guard function as a unit across centuries, that prevents individual members from leaving or defecting or simply wandering away as immortal beings with infinite time available to them sometimes do, is not entirely organic. It is, at least in part, constructed, maintained by a gift applied continuously and invisibly to every person within Chelsea's range, which in Volterra means effectively everyone. Consider what this means for the Volturi's claim to legitimate governance. One of the foundations of legitimate authority is the genuine willingness of those who operate within it to do so. Coerced obedience and genuine loyalty are different things, and the difference matters philosophically, even when the practical outcomes are identical. The Volturi present themselves as a governing body whose Guard members serve because they choose to, because they recognize the value of what the Volturi maintain, because they are committed to the project of order and secrecy that the Volturi represent. Chelsea's gift means that this presentation cannot be taken at face value. The emotional experience of loyalty in Volterra may be genuine. Chelsea's gift does not appear to create false emotions that the person experiencing them recognizes as false, but it is manufactured. It is the product of an external intervention applied without the knowledge or consent of those it affects, shaping their emotional reality in ways that serve the interests of the structure rather than the authentic development of their own feelings. Chelsea is, in this sense, the most foundational member of the Guard. Jane and Alec produce the most dramatic visible effects. Dmitri performs the most practically impressive feats, but Chelsea is the one whose gift makes it possible for the Guard to exist as a stable, coherent unit across centuries of immortal life. Without her, the natural entropy that affects any long-term organization, the drifting loyalties, the accumulated grievances, the slow erosion of commitment over decades and centuries of proximity, would eventually produce defections, dissent, fragmentation. With her, the structure remains intact indefinitely, its emotional foundations continuously reinforced by a gift whose operation is invisible to those it affects. Aro is aware of all of this. Aro, who has touched Chelsea's mind and read the complete history of her gift's development and application, understands exactly what she does and exactly how the guard's emotional architecture depends on her continuous operation. And he has chosen to build his entire governance structure on this foundation, rather than on the organic loyalty that genuine and freely chosen commitment would produce. That choice is itself a statement about what the Volturi actually are beneath the ceremonial language of order and law. Renata protects Aro physically. Her gift deflects approach, not through any aggressive mechanism, not by causing harm to those who come near, but by producing in anyone who attempts to reach Aro a subtle and persistent redirection of attention and intention, a gentle but irresistible sense that approaching him directly is not what they actually wanted to do, that there is somewhere else they should be, or something else that requires their attention. She does not stop attackers. She makes them not quite attackers, dissolving the focused intention that attack requires before it can fully form. She has been Aro's personal shield for as long as the guard has existed in its current form, and her gift means that reaching Aro in any physical confrontation requires either neutralizing her first or possessing a gift capable of bypassing her deflection entirely. Corin maintains the contentment of those who live within Volterra's walls, but are not active members of the guard. The Volturi wives, Sulpicia, Athenodora, and formerly Didim, live in the inner chambers in a seclusion that they apparently experience as comfortable and chosen, but that is, in Corin's absence, a form of very comfortable imprisonment. The wives do not leave. They do not travel or engage with the broader vampire world, or develop independent relationships or interests that might eventually pull their attention and their loyalties towards something outside Volterra. Corin's gift ensures they do not want to, producing a continuous low-level contentment that makes the walls of their existence feel like a chosen home rather than the boundaries of a cage. This is not presented in the saga as a benign arrangement. It is presented as one of the more quietly disturbing details of how the Volturi actually function. The gift that keeps the people who might otherwise have legitimate personal grievances about their circumstances from ever developing those grievances into anything actionable. There is a pattern in the specific gifts that populate the guard that extends beyond the strategic functions each one serves individually. When the guard is examined as a complete system, what becomes visible is not just coverage of specific vulnerabilities, but an interlocking quality, a way in which the gifts reinforce and complement each other such that the whole is considerably more formidable than the sum of its parts would suggest. Dimitri ensures that no one who leaves Volterra under adverse circumstances can stay lost. Chelsea ensures that the emotional motivation to leave in the first place is continuously suppressed. Jane and Alec ensure that once the Volturi arrive at a confrontation, the physical outcome is effectively predetermined regardless of the opposing force's capabilities. Renata ensures that the leadership directing all of this cannot be reached through direct physical intervention. Corinne ensures that the non-combatant members of the Volterra community remain content within their circumstances and do not become sources of internal instability. Each gift covers a different vulnerability. Each gift supports the function of the others. The failure of any one of them would create a gap that the remaining gifts would struggle to fully compensate for. But the presence of all of them together creates a system without meaningful gaps, It is, as a structure, close to complete. Close to the kind of comprehensive coverage that one arrives at through deliberate design rather than through the accumulation of fortunate coincidences. The question of how this assembly occurred, how each of these specific individuals with each of these specific gifts came to be in Volterra rather than in one of the many other places in the world they might have ended up, is a question the Guard's existence implicitly poses, but does not answer directly. The saga does not provide complete biographical histories for every Guard member. What it provides is enough detail to establish the pattern and enough specificity about individual cases to make the pattern credible. What is documented is that the Volturi actively recruit gifted vampires, that Aro pursues those whose abilities serve strategic purposes, that the invitations extended to gifted individuals carry the weight of expectations rather than the genuine openness of offers, that the alternatives to joining the Guard for a gifted vampire who has attracted Aro's attention are not always as clearly available as they might appear. Laurent, who encounters the Volturi in the period between his separation from James and Victoria and his approach to the Cullens in Breaking Dawn, describes the Volturi in terms that suggest the decision to align with them was less than entirely free, a recognition that certain associations, once offered, become difficult to decline without incurring costs that most vampires would prefer to avoid. The Guard is also not static. It has evolved across 3,000 years as the Volturi's understanding of their own vulnerabilities has evolved, as new gifts have appeared in the vampire world and been assessed for their strategic value, as gaps in the existing coverage have been identified and addressed. This is not the behavior of an organization that assembled itself once and maintained the result indefinitely. It is the behavior of an organization that continues to actively manage its own composition, continuously scanning the vampire world for additions that would improve its current capabilities, continuously working to address the vulnerabilities that each new confrontation or development reveals. The Breaking Dawn confrontation, in this light, is instructive not only as a demonstration of what the Guard can do, but as a demonstration of what the Guard could not do, and what Aro's response to that discovery appears to have been. The shield that Bella's gift provided proved capable of neutralizing Jane and Alex simultaneously, which is to say it proved capable of neutralizing the two abilities that the entire Guard's confrontational methodology was built around. Aro, who touched Renesmee and accessed the memories she contained, who touched Alice before her departure and read what she chose to show him, who had every strategic tool his experience could provide available to him in that field. Aro chose to withdraw, not because the law had been satisfied or justice had been served, but because the calculation no longer favored the outcome he had come to achieve. The shield changed the mathematics of the confrontation completely. And what does a system designed to identify and acquire extraordinary gifts do when it encounters an extraordinary gift it does not possess? It does not give up. It files the information. It adjusts its long-term strategic position. It continues to operate, patient as it has always been, waiting for circumstances to develop in a direction that makes acquisition more feasible. The Guard that exists today in Volterra is not the final version of what Aro is building. It is the current version, the most complete expression of 3,000 years of refinement, still in the process of being improved by an architect who does not experience time as a limitation. The assembly of this guard across those 3,000 years has required identifying gifted humans before they were transformed, acquiring gifted vampires whose abilities became apparent after transformation, eliminating those whose existence represented a competing development that the Volturi system could not incorporate, and continuously managing the loyalty and contentment of those already within the structure through Chelsea's gift and Corin's gift, and the foundational psychological architecture that Jane and Alec's history with Aro produced at the very beginning of their existence as vampires. It is, when held at sufficient distance to be seen whole, one of the most sustained and deliberate exercises of strategic intelligence that any being, human or vampire, has ever undertaken. It is also one that has been conducted entirely without public acknowledgement of its actual nature, hidden beneath the entirely real and genuinely functional apparatus of vampire governance, invisible to most of the immortal world precisely because the governance is real enough that very few individuals have ever had sufficient reason, information, and safety to question what was operating beneath it. The guard did not assemble itself. Each gift in Volterra is there because someone with 3,000 years of knowledge, patience, and the most comprehensive understanding of vampire gifts ever accumulated looked at a human being or a newly made vampire and recognized what they were worth, and then did what was necessary to ensure that worth ended up in Volterra. That is not coincidence. That is not governance. That is architecture. Vladimir and Stefan remember a different world. This is not metaphor or sentiment. It is a specific and consequential fact about what the two surviving members of the Romanian coven represent in the context of vampire history. They are, by the time the saga's final confrontation assembles its extraordinary gathering of vampires in a snowy field outside Forks, the oldest vampires present apart from the Volturi themselves. They predate the Volturi's dominance. They predate the formalization of vampire law. They predate, in Vladimir's and Stefan's own reckoning, most of what the contemporary vampire world accepts as simply the way things have always been. They remember when the way things are now was not yet established, when the outcome of the contest for vampire supremacy was not yet decided, when the world that exists now was only one of several possible worlds that might have emerged from the dynamics of that earlier and considerably more contested period. They did not come to the Breaking Dawn gathering out of principle or out of any genuine concern for the specific situation involving Renesmee Cullen. They came because they hate the Volturi with a consistency and a depth that 3,000 years of exile and defeat and reduction have only intensified, and because any gathering of vampires willing to stand against the Volturi is a gathering they will travel any distance to be part of. Their presence is not idealistic. It carries no philosophical commitment to justice or to the protection of the innocent or to the correction of a false accusation. It is the presence of the last survivors of something that was deliberately and methodically destroyed, returning to witness their destroyer's next operation with whatever they still possess, which at this point is primarily their testimony, their memory, and the simple, undeniable fact of their survival, as proof that the Volturi's version of history is not the only version that exists. What Vladimir and Stefan testify to, simply by existing and remembering, is that the vampire world was not always governed from Volterra, that the structure which presents itself as the natural and necessary order of things is not natural at all, that it was built deliberately and over an extended period on the ruins of everything that preceded it. Before the Volturi's consolidation, the vampire world was organized differently, more loosely, more regionally, more in the manner of competing powers whose relationships were defined by negotiation and conflict, and the shifting dynamics of alliances that formed and dissolved according to circumstance rather than by the hierarchical submission to a single authority that characterizes the contemporary structure. Power was distributed across multiple covens and individuals, each with their own territorial claims and their own resources and their own accumulated strength. The balance among these powers was not peaceful or just or stable in any admirable sense. It was simply a balance, maintained by the mutual recognition that attacking any of the other significant powers directly carried costs that made such attacks generally inadvisable. The vampire world before Volterra was not a golden age. It was an armed equilibrium. The Romanian coven in that earlier world was itself a dominant power. Vladimir and Stefan held authority over a significant portion of the vampire world, not through the pretense of governance or the language of law and order and necessary civilization, but through the older and more straightforward mechanism of being powerful enough that challenging them directly was not a rational choice for most other vampires. They ruled in the manner that dominant powers have always ruled before the development of institutional authority, through demonstrated capability and the credible threat of consequence for defiance. They extracted tribute, they controlled territory, they made decisions about who was permitted to hunt in which regions and under what conditions. And those decisions were respected because the alternative to respecting them was conflict with a power that had repeatedly demonstrated its ability to prevail in such conflicts. They were not gentle rulers. The saga does not present them as lost innocents whose golden age was stolen by Volturi villainy. Vladimir and Stefan, in the glimpses the narrative provides of their character and their historical behavior, are clearly beings whose own exercise of power was not characterized by particular restraint or philosophical sophistication about the ethics of domination. They ruled because they could, and they used that rule to benefit themselves, and they maintained it through whatever means were most effective. The world they presided over was not more just or more humane than the world the Volturi subsequently built. It was simply differently organized, with different people holding the concentrated power. This detail matters because it means the story of what happened to the Romanian coven is not a story about the destruction of something good. It is a story about the destruction of something that existed by something that wanted to exist instead, using methods that were more sophisticated and more patient and ultimately more comprehensive than anything the Romanian coven or any other competing power had available to counter them. The Volturi did not defeat the Romanian coven in open battle and replace their dominance with something more legitimate. The Romanian coven was not broken in any conventional sense of two comparable forces meeting directly and one prevailing through superior strength or strategy in the moment of confrontation. What happened to the Romanian coven and to every other power structure that preceded the Volturi's consolidation was something considerably more patient and considerably harder to perceive while it was occurring, let alone to oppose. the Volturi understood, with a clarity that suggests either extraordinary foresight or the accumulated wisdom of beings old enough to have watched many previous contests play out and to have identified the consistent patterns in their outcomes. That direct assault on an established power carries costs that strategic erosion avoids. A direct assault requires committing resources to a conflict whose outcome is uncertain, risks the loss of gifted members whose abilities are not easily replaced, creates witnesses to the violence and the grievance that witnesses carry, and generates the kind of collective memory in the broader vampire world that can eventually motivate organized opposition against the victor. A power that achieves dominance through open warfare is a power that everyone who observed that warfare knows they need to fear. And feared powers attract the kind of organized resistance that stable powers do not. Strategic erosion operates differently. It works through mechanisms that are individually deniable. An alliance that simply fails to materialize when expected. A trusted lieutenant who develops different priorities over time. An external pressure that appears unrelated to any Volturi action, but conveniently weakens a rival at a critical moment. And collectively devastating. It targets the relationships that hold a power structure together, rather than the structure's physical capability. It cultivates division rather than confronting unity. It creates conditions in which the target weakens from within, through the gradual failure of the bonds and alliances and loyalties that gave it coherence and resilience, and then arrives with force when the weakening has advanced far enough that the final application of that force is not a genuine battle, but the conclusion of a process that was already essentially complete. Marcus's gift made this approach not merely possible, but extraordinarily effective over the timescales across which the Volturi were willing to operate. The ability to see emotional bonds, their precise nature, their current strength, their direction, the subtle shifts that indicate whether they are strengthening or fraying, is in a governance context a tool for understanding and mediating relationships between parties in dispute. In a strategic context, applied to the problem of understanding and ultimately dismantling competing power structures, it is a map of every vulnerability those structures possess. Marcus could examine the Romanian coven and see, with a clarity available to no other observer in the vampire world, exactly which relationships held it together under pressure and which were already showing the kind of strain that, properly encouraged, could become something more serious. He could identify the alliances that were genuine expressions of mutual commitment and those that were maintained by habit or convenience or the absence of a better alternative. He could trace the specific bonds between the Romanian coven and its various supporters and allies across the vampire world, seeing in each bond both its current condition and perhaps its likely trajectory under various kinds of pressure. 3,000 years of this information, provided continuously to Aro through the mechanism of touch and processed with Aro's extraordinary patience and strategic intelligence, produced outcomes that the Romanian coven and every other competing power experienced from the inside as a series of unfortunate developments, as bad luck accumulating beyond reasonable probability, as betrayal by allies who turned out to be less reliable than they had seemed, as the accumulated effect of ordinary adversity striking at particularly inopportune moments, rather than as the deliberate application of a coordinated strategy designed to isolate and weaken them, before the Volturi ever appeared with sufficient force to make the outcome unmistakable. Chelsea's gift completed, in each specific case, what Marcus's gift identified as the most productive target. Once the Volturi's analysis had determined which bonds were critical to a competing power's coherence, which loyalties and alliances and personal relationships provided the emotional infrastructure that held the structure together when it came under pressure, Chelsea could work on those bonds directly, strengthening the Volturi's own relationships with individuals who might prove useful to peel away from competing loyalties, weakening the connections between those individuals and the structures they currently belong to. Gradually, invisibly, over timescales that no individual member of any targeted coven could perceive as a coordinated process rather than the natural evolution of their own feelings, reshaping the emotional landscape of the vampire world in ways that systematically and consistently favored the continued development and consolidation of Volturi dominance. The Romanian coven's eventual fall was the endpoint of this process applied over an extended period, culminating in a confrontation that took place after the erosion had done its essential work rather than before it. By the time the Volturi moved against the Romanian coven with sufficient force to end their dominance definitively, the broader vampire world that might in other circumstances have intervened or provided meaningful support had already been gradually repositioned through Chelsea's influence on key relationships, through the elimination of allied covens, under the justification of various technical violations of laws that were themselves relatively new, through the simple, cumulative, mathematical effect of time and patience applied to the problem of reducing a competing power's external support base into something that watched the confrontation rather than participated in it. The Romanian coven fell not solely because they were weaker than the Volturi, in raw terms by the moment of confrontation, though years of strategic erosion had likely produced exactly that outcome, but because the infrastructure of relationship and alliance and mutual commitment that might have sustained them through a serious challenge no longer existed in the form it would have needed to take to make a difference. What remained was Vladimir and Stefan, two vampires preserved by the extraordinary durability of their kind from the simple passage of time, surviving through whatever combination of caution and fortune and genuine capability allowed them to outlast what destroyed everything around them, carrying the memory of a different world into a present that has no interest in what that memory reveals, because the entity that controls the present has spent 3,000 years ensuring that the past it replaced is remembered only in the terms most favorable to the replacement. They are bitter. The saga presents their bitterness not as a recent wound or an acute grievance, but as a condition, something so deep and so long maintained that it has become structural rather than emotional, built into the architecture of who they are after 3,000 years of living with it. But bitterness of that depth and that duration is not simple resentment or wounded pride or the inability to accept loss with equanimity. It is the accumulated weight of a specific and particular knowledge. The knowledge that what happened to them was not the natural outcome of competing forces in an unpredictable world. That their dominance was not simply lost to better strategy or greater strength in the ordinary sense of those terms. That it was taken from them through a process so patient and so comprehensive that they could not fully perceive it while it was happening, could not identify the specific interventions or name the mechanism that was dismantling their world around them, and could only watch across centuries as everything they had built was absorbed into the structure of their destroyer's empire, while that destroyer presented the absorption as the natural order asserting itself. That knowledge, carried for 3,000 years without the possibility of resolution or redress, or any meaningful opportunity to correct the record, produces a very specific and very understandable quality of feeling. Vladimir and Stefan are not simply angry about what happened to them. They are angry about what the vampire world has forgotten about what happened to them, about the way the Volturi's version of history has been so successfully established that most contemporary vampires genuinely do not know that there was ever another version. The Egyptian coven presents a different but illuminating variation on the pattern's application. Amun, who leads that coven, is old enough to have personal memory of the period of Volturi consolidation, or at least to carry inherited knowledge of it from vampires who did. His behavior in the saga, his deep discomfort with any situation that brings his coven into Volturi awareness, his anxious and constant assessment of risk whenever the Volturi's attention might turn in his direction, his management of his relationships with other vampires, with a carefulness that reflects long experience with the specific dangers of attracting the wrong kind of notice, describes someone who understands the pattern from the perspective of a survivor who has navigated within it rather than been destroyed by it. Amun turned Benjamin. He identified something in Benjamin as a human that suggested what he might become as a vampire, made the decision to transform him, and has spent the time since Benjamin's transformation maintaining a fierce and anxious possessiveness about that relationship. He resists the Volturi's awareness of Benjamin's gift, wherever the resistance is feasible. He frames his relationship with Benjamin in terms of creator and creation, of debt and loyalty and obligation, that serve to keep Benjamin oriented toward Amun, rather than toward the broader vampire world and its most acquisitive power. He behaves, in short, exactly like someone who understands what the Volturi do when they identify a sufficiently gifted vampire, and who has been living for an extended period with the specific and practical fear of that understanding applied to someone he is invested significantly in. Amun's situation reveals something important about how widely the Volturi's methodology is understood among the older members of the vampire world. He did not arrive at his possessiveness about Benjamin through paranoia or unfounded anxiety. He arrived at it through the same kind of accumulated observation that produced Carlyle's understanding of the gift amplification principle. Through watching, across enough time and across enough individual cases, the consistent pattern of what happens to gifted vampires who come to Aro's attention. He knows the pattern well enough to have made specific decisions about how to manage his own coven in relation to it, and the specific decisions he has made, transforming a gifted human himself before the Volturi could identify and acquire the potential, maintaining fierce control over that relationship, keeping Benjamin's full capabilities as obscured from Volturi awareness as possible, are exactly the decisions that someone would make if they understood the system and were trying to operate within it without becoming its next acquisition target. The nomadic vampires who move through the world without fixed covens represent a third dimension of the pattern's operation. True nomads are not, in most cases, a threat to Volturi authority in any direct sense. Their lack of fixed structure, accumulated resources, and stable relationships means they cannot organize resistance or develop independent gifted vampire cultivation programs of any significance. But nomads who begin to accumulate, who form the kind of informal extended networks that might eventually solidify into something more structured, or who individually develop gifts impressive enough to warrant attention, attract a qualitatively different response from the Volturi than the ordinary tolerance extended to non-threatening independent vampires. The historical record of the vampire world, as it can be reconstructed from the testimony of those old enough to remember significant portions of it, includes numerous examples of informal groupings and individually impressive nomads who were disrupted or redirected before they could consolidate into anything the Volturi would need to take seriously as a competing power. These disruptions were conducted through enforcement actions that were entirely legally justified under the Volturi's law. Exposure risks, inappropriate transformations, violations of territorial understandings, and simultaneously very precisely targeted at the specific relationships and specific gifted individuals that made the groupings potentially significant rather than merely incidentally inconvenient. The consistency of this precision across 3,000 years of enforcement activity is itself evidence of the pattern. Law enforcement that serves only its stated purpose is imprecise in its effects, catching those who violate rules without particular attention, to which violators happen to be developing into threats of a specific kind. Law enforcement that consistently, across a very long period, manages to address the precise individuals and relationships that would most threaten the enforcing power's strategic position, while leaving equivalent violations by less strategically significant parties to be addressed with less urgency or not at all, is law enforcement that is doing more than one thing at once. The Cullens, when examined in this context, represent exactly the kind of case the pattern has encountered before in various forms, and has always, in the historical record, ultimately managed. They are law-abiding to a degree that removes the most obvious justifications for direct action. They are connected to a wide network of vampire acquaintances and allies built through Carlyle's centuries of peaceful and respectful engagement with the broader immortal world, which makes isolated action against them considerably more costly in terms of the relationships it would disrupt and the message it would send about the safety of independent covens that maintain good relations with the Volturi. And they possess gifted members whose abilities the Volturi want too much to risk destroying without first exhausting every available option for acquisition. The false accusation regarding Renesmee is, in this light, a recognizable instance of the pattern applied to a target that resists easier methods. The Volturi arrive with overwhelming force, justified by an accusation that would constitute a genuine and serious violation if accurate. They discover that the accusation is not accurate, that the evidence assembled by the Cullens and their witnesses is sufficient to make proceeding on the original basis untenable without incurring costs that exceed the likely gains. They withdraw, but not before Aro has touched Renesmee and read what she carries, touched Alice's vision and seen what she chose to show him. assess the gifted members of the assembled opposition with the practiced eye of someone who has been evaluating vampire gifts for 3,000 years and updated his understanding of what the Cullen Coven represents in the long-term strategic picture in ways that will inform whatever approach he takes next. The withdrawal is not, in Arrow's framework, a defeat. It is information. It is the accumulation of data about a situation that has not yet resolved in the direction he prefers, filed with the patience of someone who measures time in centuries and has learned through 3,000 years of practice that very few situations are permanently closed. The pattern does not require immediate success. It requires only that the option remain available and that the information necessary for future action continue to accumulate, and that the broader structure within which individual situations play out remains intact and continues to function. Vladimir and Stefan came to Forks because they have wanted to watch the Volturi face genuine opposition for 3,000 years. They have watched the pattern consume everything around them, have watched every challenge fail or be preemptively eliminated, have watched the accumulated weight of Volterra's patience and strategic intelligence prove consistently sufficient to maintain its position against everything the vampire world has produced. They did not get the battle they came for, but they witnessed something the pattern has provided very rarely across its entire operational history. They watched Aro calculate and hesitate, and ultimately choose to withdraw from a confrontation that he had come to win, because the mathematics of the situation, because a human girl's impossible gift, fully expressed as a vampire ability and deployed in defense of the coven the Volturi most wanted to absorb, had resolved in a direction he could not make favorable. For two vampires who have spent 3,000 years carrying the memory of what was taken from them and watching the taker continue to prosper, that withdrawal carried a significance that went beyond the immediate situation. It was not victory. It was not justice or resolution or the restoration of anything that was lost, but it was evidence, visible and undeniable evidence observed at close range, that the architecture has a point of failure, and a flaw that has been demonstrated once can be found again. That is what Vladimir and Stefan carry back into their long exile. Not the battle they wanted, and not the end of the Volturi's dominance, and not any meaningful recovery of what 3,000 years of patient destruction took from them, but the memory of a morning in a snowy field when the most powerful and most patient architect in the history of the immortal world looked at what stood against him and chose not to proceed. It is not enough, but after 3,000 years of nothing, it is something, and something, however small, is where every challenge to a seemingly permanent power has always had to begin. There is a moment in the biology classroom at Forks High School, on an ordinary Monday in January of 2005, when Edward Cullen reaches out with the gift he has carried for nearly a century and finds nothing. Not silence in the way that a quiet room is silent, where the absence of sound is itself a kind of presence, a texture, a thing you can feel against your attention. This is a different quality entirely, a complete and structural absence, as though the space where Bella Swan's thoughts should be broadcasting into his consciousness, as every other human mind in that building is broadcasting, as every mind in every room Edward has ever entered has always broadcast. In the relentless and exhausting stream he has spent 90 years learning to manage, simply does not exist, He reaches for her mind the way he has reached for every mind he has ever encountered, automatically, without effort, as natural as breathing was when he still breathed, and finds a wall so seamless and so complete that it does not even register as a wall. It registers as nothing, as the space where something should be and isn't. He has never experienced anything like it. Not once in nearly a century of hearing everyone. This is the moment that changes everything for Edward, and it is worth holding in place long enough to understand what it actually demonstrates. Bella Swan is, at this point in the story, entirely human. She has not been transformed. She has no knowledge of the vampire world, no understanding of gifts or shields, or the mechanics of what her mind is doing to Edward's perception. She is simply a girl who is transferred to a new school in a small rainy town, sitting down at a biology lab table, opening her textbook. She is not trying to block Edward's gift. She's not aware that his gift exists. She's not doing anything at all, consciously or deliberately, to produce the effect she's producing. And yet, the effect is total, complete, without exception or variation, or the kind of partial permeability that might suggest a weaker or less fully developed version of the ability. She is simply, entirely, and effortlessly absent from the mental landscape that Edward perceives, in a way that no human being has ever been absent from it before. This is not a vampire gift. This is a human trait, already fully operational, already doing something that should not be within the scope of human psychological architecture, in a girl who has never heard the word vampire spoken in anything other than a fictional context. The shield that will eventually be recognized as one of the most extraordinary abilities the Volturi have ever encountered. The shield that will, in the saga's climactic confrontation, protect an entire assembled coven from the full offensive arsenal of the most powerful guard in the history of the immortal world, is already there, already working, already complete in its essential function, constrained only by the limitations of the human body that carries it, waiting for transformation to remove those limitations and allow it to express itself at its full potential scale. Bella's mental privacy as a human is documented not just through Edward's experience of her silence. It is visible in the way other people consistently fail to fully read her, in the way she moves through social environments, leaving less impression on the people around her than her actual presence and personality would seem to warrant, in the way even those who know her well are regularly surprised by what she thinks and feels and decides. She is not emotionally closed in the ordinary social sense. She is not performing reserve or maintaining deliberate distance. She simply does not broadcast. The natural transparency that most human beings exhibit without realizing it. The unconscious leakage of inner experience through expression and posture and tone that makes people legible to careful observers is genuinely absent in Bella, in a way that is not learned behavior but structural reality. Jacob Black, who can read people with the particular acuity of someone whose nature is attuned to emotional and physical states in ways ordinary humans are not, consistently finds Bella harder to read than he expects. Aro, who can access complete mental histories through a single touch, and who has touched thousands of minds across 3,000 years, finds nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a weak signal or a degraded version of what he expected, or the partial resistance that a few vampires have demonstrated across the centuries. the complete and utter absence of anything to read in a living human being who is standing in front of him, whose heart is beating and whose mind is clearly functioning because she is speaking and responding and processing the extraordinary situation she finds herself in. His reaction to that absence is the most telling detail in the entire sequence of his interactions with Bella. Aro is not a being who is easily surprised. 3,000 years of accumulating knowledge, of touching every significant mind he has encountered and reading its complete history, of building an archive of understanding about the vampire world and the humans who move through it, that exceeds anything any other being has ever assembled. 3,000 years of this has produced someone whose equanimity in the face of the unexpected is one of his most consistent and most carefully maintained characteristics. He has seen things that should have produced visible reaction and has responded with the smooth ceremonial composure of someone who has learned that visible surprise is a form of vulnerability. He does not often allow himself to be seen as unprepared for what he encounters. With Bella, in the throne room in Volterra, in the events that follow her near exposure in Italy, he allows it. The wonder that crosses his face when he makes contact with her hand and finds the silence is genuine, in a way that his usual careful composure does not permit most of his reactions to be. He describes her, in that moment, with a directness and an enthusiasm that stands out sharply against the controlled language he typically deploys. He says that she is extraordinary. He says that she is one of the most remarkable individuals he has ever encountered. He says this about a human girl who is standing in his throne room, having narrowly escaped being killed for the crime of knowing too much about vampires. And he says it with a warmth and an immediacy that suggests the assessment is not diplomatic performance but genuine recognition. And then, in almost the same breath, he extends an invitation. The invitation is framed in the language of opportunity and admiration, as Aro's invitations always are. He would be so pleased if she would consider remaining in Volterra. The company would benefit so enormously from her presence. Her abilities, once she is transformed, would be a remarkable addition to what they have already assembled. The offer is gracious and warm and carries beneath its graciousness the unmistakable architecture of a demand, not yet urgent, not yet pressed with the force that Aro could bring to bear if he chose, but present, noted, left on the table with the patience of someone who fully expects the table to remain in place long enough for circumstances to evolve in a more favorable direction. What Aro recognized in that moment of silent contact was not simply an interesting human anomaly. It was the most complete expression of a pre-transformation gift he had ever encountered. The shield was not partially developed or tentatively present or limited in its application in the way that even very significant human precursors to vampire gifts typically are. Alice's visions as a human were fragmentary and unreliable. Edward's observational acuity was extraordinary, but still operated within the constraints of ordinary human perception. Jasper's empathic sensitivity was remarkable but passive, receiving rather than projecting, limited to what the people around him were already feeling, rather than capable of shaping what they felt. These were significant precursors, meaningful signals of what would emerge after transformation, but they were clearly incomplete versions of what they would eventually become. Bella's shield was complete. It was doing already in its human expression exactly what it would do as a vampire gift. It was blocking access to her mind. Not partially, not inconsistently, not in ways that varied based on the strength or the proximity of the person trying to read her. Totally. The human version was already performing its essential function at full effectiveness, constrained only in scope, protecting only Bella herself, unable yet to extend outward to cover others, by the biological limitations of a human nervous system, never designed to support something of this nature. Aro, who has spent 3,000 years learning to read the pre-transformation signal that indicates what a human will become, would have understood immediately and completely what the full vampire expression of this gift would look like. A shield of this completeness and this effortlessness, freed from the biological constraints of human physiology, extended to its full vampire potential, would be something without precedent in his documented experience. Not just a mind that could not be read, a mind that could protect other minds, a shield that could extend outward, covering not just its owner, but everyone its owner chose to protect, rendering them collectively invisible to every mental gift that Volterra's most powerful members possessed. The strategic implications of this for a governing body whose offensive capability depends critically on Jane's ability to incapacitate individual targets and Alec's ability to neutralize groups simultaneously are enormous. Bella's gift, fully expressed, would make the Volturi's two most devastating weapons completely ineffective against anyone she chose to protect. It would not merely add a defensive capability to whatever coven possessed it. It would negate the specific abilities that make the Volturi unapproachable as a military force, that make resistance to them essentially irrational for any coven that does not possess an equivalent defensive counter. This is what was standing in his throne room in Volterra. This is what Aro recognized in the moment of silent contact, understood in its full implications, within the span of that recognition, and then watched walk out of his domain still, human, and still belonging to the Cullen Coven, rather than to him. The question of whether the Volturi were aware of Bella before Edward found her is one that the saga does not answer directly, and one that the script's central argument requires be examined honestly rather than resolved through convenient inference. The direct evidence is not available. There is no documented instance of prior Volturi contact with Bella or her family. No confirmation that she appeared in any monitoring system the Volturi maintained for identifying humans with unusual potential. What is available is circumstantial and structural. The Volturi's network of awareness is extensive and has had 3,000 years to develop its reach. Bella's gift was already fully operational as a human trait, which means it was already producing effects visible to anyone paying the right kind of attention. Specifically, its effect on Edward's mind reading would have been visible to any vampire with a similar gift who encountered her, and the Volturi have had mind readers in their service across their entire history. A human being whose mind cannot be read by a vampire telepath is, in a world where vampire telepaths occasionally move through human populations, the kind of anomaly that tends to get noticed and reported by those who encounter it. Whether the Volturi system had identified Bella and was in the process of assessing her potential before the events of the saga overtook that timeline, or whether she genuinely arrived in the Cullen orbit through the kind of genuine accident that Aro's system is specifically designed to prevent is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What can be said is that either answer produces its own unsettling implication. If the Volturi had identified her and were moving toward acquisition when Edward transformed the situation, then the entire first volume of the saga is operating against a background of Volturi interest that none of the characters are aware of except possibly Aro. If they had not identified her, if a human with the most complete pre-transformation gift expression in documented vampire history somehow moved through Aro's monitoring system without triggering the response such a gift should have triggered, then the system has a gap in its coverage that its operator may not yet fully understand. What is not in question is the Volturi's behavior after the Volterra encounter establishes beyond any doubt what Bella is. From that point forward, the interest is documented, consistent, and carried with a particular quality of patience that characterizes all of Aro's long-term strategic positions. The invitation issued in Volterra does not expire. It is referenced again, by implication, and by the continuing architecture of the Volturi's engagement with the Cullen Coven, in every subsequent interaction the saga documents. Bella's transformation, when it eventually occurs, does not produce in the Volturi the kind of alarm that the unauthorized transformation of a knowledgeable human might theoretically generate. It produces instead a specific and documented interest in assessing what she has become, conducted through the mechanism of the Breaking Dawn Confrontation's examination of the Cullen Coven's assembled capabilities. When Aro touches Bella's hand in that final confrontation, after her transformation, and finds not the silence he encountered in Volterra, but the full and extraordinary expression of what that silence always indicated was possible, his reaction is a confirmation. He is not discovering something new. He is verifying something he already knew, with the particular satisfaction of finding that an assessment made years earlier under more limited conditions has proven accurate. The shield is everything he understood it would be, perhaps more, and it is operating in defense of the people standing against him, rather than in service of the people standing with him. This is the loss that the Volturi system produced through its own limitations. Bella Swan arrived in Carlisle's orbit before Aro could bring his full attention to bear on what she represented. She was found by a vampire whose relationship to her was not strategic but personal, who valued her not as a resource or an acquisition but as a person, and who used whatever influence he had over her eventual transformation to ensure that it occurred within a framework of genuine choice and genuine relationship, rather than Volturi management. She was transformed into the Cullen Coven, bonded to it by every kind of loyalty that Chelsea's gift cannot manufacture, because it cannot replicate what genuinely chosen commitment produces over time. And the gift that Aro recognized and wanted and understood better than anyone else in the world, the gift that he could see from the moment of its human expression, would be one of the most important abilities in the history of the immortal world, ended up protecting the one coven willing to stand against him. Bella Swan was not the most dangerous thing the Volturi ever found in the human world. She was the most dangerous thing they ever failed to acquire. And the difference between those two descriptions is the difference between a system that worked and a system that, at its single most critical juncture, did not. The girl who could not be read became the woman who could not be touched. The human who slipped past the Volturi's attention became the vampire whose gift negated their greatest weapons. The rarest human the system ever encountered became the most significant failure the system ever produced, and she never knew she was supposed to be theirs. There is a way of understanding Victoria that has nothing to do with revenge. The revenge is real. The loss of James, the decision to pursue Bella as retaliation for Edward's destruction of her mate, the construction of an entire newborn army in service of that pursuit. These are the motivating facts of Victoria's arc in the saga, and they are not in dispute. But beneath the revenge narrative, beneath the story of a mate lost and a debt to be repaid in kind, Victoria represents something that the script's central argument requires be examined on its own terms. She represents what happens when the process of vampire creation operates entirely outside the system the Volturi have spent 3,000 years building to control it. She represents unregulated power, and what the Volturi do about unregulated power, how they respond to it, how long they wait, what they are watching for while they wait, reveals something about their priorities that the governance framework they present to the vampire world is not designed to make visible. Victoria's gift is self-preservation. This is how the saga classifies it, and the classification is accurate as far as it goes, but it understates what the gift actually is in practice. Self-preservation suggests a passive or reactive capability, something that activates in response to threat and helps its carrier escape danger they would otherwise not survive. What Victoria demonstrates across the saga is something considerably more active and more comprehensive than that description implies. Her gift is an intuitive awareness of danger that operates ahead of conscious processing, that registers threats before they fully materialize and generates the correct evasive response before the carrier has time to think about what that response should be. It is not simply that Victoria survives situations that would kill most vampires. It is that she navigates those situations with an efficiency and a precision that reflects something operating below the level of deliberate decision-making, something that reads the immediate future with enough accuracy to root around it consistently and without failure. This gift has a human origin, as all gifts do. Victoria's human life, as the saga presents it in its limited references to her background, was defined by the need to survive in circumstances that were not designed with her survival in mind. The specific details of that life are not fully elaborated in the canon, but the broad outline is clear enough. She was someone who had learned early and through direct and costly experience that the world was not safe and that the people in it could not be reliably counted upon to protect her from its dangers. She had developed across a human life that required it, an acuity for sensing threat and an instinct for self-preservation that went beyond ordinary caution into something closer to a preternatural awareness of the emotional and situational currents that preceded danger. The transformation took that awareness and made it absolute, made it operate at the speed of vampire cognition rather than the slower rhythms of human neural processing, made it accurate enough to function as a genuine predictive capacity rather than simply a very well-developed instinct. The result is a vampire who, across the entire saga, is never caught, never cornered, never placed in a situation from which she cannot extract herself with enough speed and enough precision to escape intact. The werewolf pack pursues her across months of the second and third volumes. Edward hunts her. Alice tries to track her decisions through precognitive sight. None of them succeed in bringing her to a confrontation she does not choose to enter, until the moment in Eclipse when she chooses to enter one and miscalculates the specific nature of the opposition she is facing. Her gift does not fail her there. Her assessment of the tactical situation does. The gift is real and it is extraordinary, and it is, in the framework of the script's central argument, exactly the kind of ability that a system designed to identify and acquire gifted humans should have been positioned to recognize and pursue, long before Victoria was ever transformed. Instead, Victoria was transformed by James, a nomadic tracker who operated according to his own interests and his own criteria for what constituted interesting prey, who created Victoria as part of his own coven without reference to any larger strategic framework, and certainly without reference to what the Volturi might consider the optimal management of a human with her particular qualities. Victoria became a vampire entirely outside the system. Her gift emerged and developed outside Volterra's awareness, in the context of a nomadic coven, whose activities were not subject to the kind of monitoring that the Volturi's network applies to more established and more visible groups. By the time her gift's full scope became apparent, by the time she was doing things with her self-preservation instinct that marked her as genuinely extraordinary, rather than simply a capable survivor, she was already a formed vampire with established relationships and established patterns of movement that made her difficult to track even for the Volturi's resources. This is the first dimension of what Victoria represents in the script's argument. She's evidence that the system has gaps, that gifted humans exist who do not pass through the Volturi's acquisition process, who are found first by other vampires acting according to their own interests, who emerge as gifted vampires outside Volterra's structure, and then continue to exist in the vampire world as independent agents whose capabilities the Volturi do not control. The system is not perfect. It has never been perfect. 3,000 years of operation have made it comprehensive and highly effective. But the vampire world is large and complex, and not every gifted human who exists within it can be identified and managed before someone else finds them first. The newborn army is the second and considerably more structurally significant dimension of what Victoria represents. When Victoria decides to pursue her revenge against Bella through the creation of an army, rather than through direct action, she steps into a category of violation that the Volturi's laws treat with particular seriousness. The unauthorized mass creation of vampires, the production of newborns in numbers that cannot be controlled or concealed, the generation of exactly the kind of catastrophic exposure risk that the secrecy law is designed to prevent. She creates in the city of Seattle over the period of several months in the events preceding the Eclipse confrontation, a population of new vampires large enough to produce a measurable and documented increase in suspicious disappearances and unexplained deaths that attracts human law enforcement attention and newspaper coverage, and the kind of escalating public awareness that represents precisely the scenario the Volturi's entire governance structure exists to prevent. The Volturi know about this. They know about it relatively early in its development, well before it reaches the scale that makes it impossible to ignore or deny. Alice's gift shows the Cullen Coven, the army's existence and growth across the period of its development, which means the information is available and the situation is identifiable by anyone with access to the kind of precognitive intelligence Alice provides. The Volturi, who have their own information networks and their own methods of monitoring unusual vampire activity across their territory, which includes the entirety of the vampire world, are not operating with less information than the Cullen Coven. They are operating with more, and yet they do not intervene. Not immediately, not when intervention would be most effective at preventing the exposure risk the army represents. Not when the army is small enough that a modest deployment of the guard could dissolve it before it generates the kind of human attention it eventually generates. They wait. They watch the situation develop. They send Felix and Dmitri and Jane, eventually, but they send them after the confrontation in the mountain clearing has already occurred, after the Cullen Coven and the Quileute Wolf Pack have already destroyed the army that the Volturi's timely intervention could have prevented from ever reaching that scale. The official explanation for this delay, to the extent that the Volturi offer one, is the explanation they always offer. They were aware of the situation and were preparing an appropriate response, and the Cullen Coven's independent action simply resolved the matter before the Volturi's response was deployed. This explanation is not impossible. Large institutions do sometimes move slowly, and the geography of Seattle relative to Volterra provides at least a nominal justification for response times that might otherwise seem suspicious. But the explanation does not sit easily against the Volturi's documented behavior in other situations. The Volturi can move with extraordinary speed when they are sufficiently motivated. The journey from Volterra to Forks for the Breaking Dawn confrontation is accomplished with a rapidity that reflects genuine urgency rather than institutional inertia. The response to the false accusation regarding Renesmee is immediate, overwhelming, and precisely calibrated to arrive before any opposition can be adequately organized. The Volturi are not slow when they want to be fast. Their slowness in responding to the Seattle situation is therefore a choice, whether or not it is acknowledged as one. What might they have been waiting for? What intelligence might a patient observer extract from watching an unregulated newborn army develop, mature through its most volatile and uncontrollable early phase, and eventually be brought to confrontation by an independent coven? The answer, in the context of the script's central framework, become apparent when you consider what information the situation generated. The Seattle Army produced a confrontation in which the Cullen Coven and the Quileute Wolf Pack were forced to reveal the full scope of their combined defensive and offensive capability in a genuine high-stakes engagement. Not a diplomatic meeting or a carefully managed exhibition, but an actual fight conducted under conditions that stripped away every layer of careful presentation and required every participant to operate at their genuine capacity. The Volturi, who arrived in time to observe the aftermath and to interact with the principals while the details were still immediate and visible, gathered information about the Cullen Coven's real capabilities that a diplomatic visit or a formal inspection could not have produced. They saw what Carlyle's family could do when the constraint of maintaining appearances was removed by necessity. Jane's interaction with Bree Tanner, the one surviving newborn from Victoria's army, is particularly instructive in this context. Jane inflicts pain on Bree with a casualness that serves no purpose in terms of information gathering or genuine justice. Bree is cooperative, frightened, clearly willing to answer any question posed to her honestly and completely. The pain serves no investigative function. What it serves is demonstrative. Jane is establishing in front of the assembled Cullen Coven the Volturi's capacity for casual cruelty, the ease with which they deploy their most devastating gifts against targets who present no threat, the message that their power over any vampire in their presence is total and exercised without particular moral friction. She is reminding the Cullens, through Bree, of what the Volturi are willing to do and what standing in opposition to them eventually means. Bree is then executed, despite Carlisle's advocacy for her life and despite her complete cooperation. The execution is legal under the Volturi's framework. She is an unregistered newborn created in violation of proper protocols, and the law regarding such vampires is clear. But the law is also discretionary in its application in ways that the Volturi do not always acknowledge. Discretion was not exercised for Bree. The message delivered by her execution is not primarily a legal one. Victoria herself, as a gifted vampire who died in the confrontation before the Volturi arrived, represents a specific kind of loss in the script's framework. Her self-preservation gift, fully developed and demonstrably extraordinary across the years of the saga, died with her in the mountain clearing and was never assessed by Aro's touch, never entered into the archive of everything Aro has ever read and understood about how gifts work and what they can become. This is, in the cold logic of the system's operation, a waste. An extraordinary capability that emerged outside the system, developed outside the system, and was destroyed outside the system without ever passing through the mechanism of Aro's evaluation. Whether the Volturi would have attempted to acquire Victoria if they had arrived earlier, if they had intervened before the confrontation rather than after it, is a question the saga does not answer. But the self-preservation gift, which makes its carrier essentially impossible to catch and essentially impossible to hold against their will, would in any case have presented acquisition challenges that most gifts do not. Some gifts, even when recognized as extraordinary, are not practically acquirable. Victoria's may have been one of them. The broader implication of the newborn army situation, the one that extends beyond Victoria's specific case and beyond the specific details of the Seattle crisis, is about what unregulated transformation produces and what the Volturi's response to that production reveals about their actual priorities. Unregulated transformation is dangerous. The newborn army demonstrated this conclusively, generating exactly the kind of exposure risk and uncontrolled vampire population that the Volturi's laws against mass, unauthorized transformation are designed to prevent. The laws serve a genuine protective function, and the need for some form of oversight over vampire creation is not a cynical fiction invented to serve Aro's acquisition interests, but the laws also serve the acquisition function. Every transformation that occurs within the Volturi's awareness and approval is a transformation that can be monitored for the emergence of extraordinary gifts. Every vampire created through unauthorized mass transformation outside the Volturi's visibility is a vampire whose gift profile, if any gift emerges, is not immediately available to Aro's assessment. The prohibition on unregulated transformation is genuinely protective and simultaneously a mechanism for ensuring that the Volturi maintain information dominance over the one process that produces the resource they care most about. Both things are true at the same time, and the coexistence of both truths in a single law is exactly the kind of elegant dual function that 3,000 years of institutional design tends to produce. The newborns of Victoria's army were not assessed by Aro. Their gifts, whatever they were, emerged and died in the chaos of their brief violent existence without ever being catalogued or considered for their strategic value. From the perspective of governance, this is a successful enforcement outcome. A dangerous, unregulated population was eliminated, and the exposure risk it created was contained. From the perspective of the acquisition system operating beneath the governance, it is an intelligence failure. An entire cohort of new vampires, created from a human population of unknown composition and unknown gift potential, passed through existence without generating any information about what they carried. This is the cost of unregulated transformation. Not just the exposure risk, not just the law enforcement burden, not just the disruption to the careful management of vampire presence in human society. The cost, in the terms that matter most to the system's architect, is the information loss. The possibility that among those Seattle newborns there was someone who carried something extraordinary. A human with the kind of unusual psychological quality that transformation amplifies into genuine power. And that possibility was created and extinguished in a matter of months without Aro ever having the opportunity to find out. Victoria built her army from the available population of Seattle without selection, without assessment, without any mechanism for identifying which humans carried the pre-transformation signals that the Volturi system is specifically designed to detect. She created vampires because she needed soldiers, not because she recognized potential. The army reflected that, numerically significant, individually volatile, collectively dangerous in the specific and limited way that newborns are dangerous, but not gifted in any documented sense that distinguished it from what random, unselected mass transformation would be expected to produce. This is what unregulated power looks like in the end. Not a conspiracy, or an alternative system, or a rival architecture. Just need meeting opportunity without the patience or the knowledge to produce anything beyond the immediate and the violent. Victoria was extraordinary. Her gift was real and remarkable and wasted in the service of revenge, rather than recognized for what it represented in the larger context of vampire capability. The army she built was ordinary, random, the product of urgency rather than selection. The contrast with what the Volturi build, slowly, deliberately, across centuries, one carefully assessed individual at a time, is the clearest possible illustration of what the system's patience produces and what operating without that patience does not. Unregulated power burns fast and leaves nothing behind it. The Volturi have been building something that was designed to last forever. And in 3,000 years, despite everything and everyone that has stood against it, it has. There is a field outside Forks, Washington, covered in snow, where the largest gathering of vampires in recorded history assembles on a grey winter morning to determine whether the most powerful governing body the immortal world has ever produced will finally encounter something it cannot simply absorb or eliminate or patiently outlast. The Volturi arrive first. This detail matters more than it might initially appear. The Volturi do not arrive as investigators conducting a cautious preliminary assessment of a reported violation. They do not send an advanced delegation to evaluate the accusation before committing the full weight of their authority to a confrontation whose outcome is not yet established. They arrive as an army, Aro and Caius and Marcus at the center, flanked by the full complement of the guard, surrounded by additional members whose presence in the field represents a deployment of Volterra's resources on a scale that has no precedent in the saga's documented history of Volturi enforcement actions. They move across the snow in a formation that is unmistakably military, cloaked in black that absorbs the grey winter light, silent in the way that only beings who do not need to breathe can be silent when they choose it. The accusation that brought them here is the creation of an immortal child. The alleged evidence is a reported sighting of what appeared to be a transformed human infant in the company of the Cullen Coven. This is, on its face, one of the most serious violations the Volturi's law recognizes. A violation they have historically addressed with the most comprehensive and least forgiving enforcement responses in their documented history, eliminating not just the creator, but every vampire connected to the offense. The accusation, if accurate, would justify exactly the response the Volturi have assembled. The accusation is not accurate. Renesmee Cullen is not an immortal child. She is something the Volturi's experience and their laws have no existing category for. A child born rather than made. The biological daughter of a vampire father and a human mother, growing and developing and capable of learning and control in ways that transform children fundamentally are not. She is unprecedented. She is also, at the moment the Volturi arrive in that field, surrounded by an assembled gathering of vampire witnesses whose collective testimony and direct observation of Renesmee's nature constitute a body of evidence that no honest evaluation of the accusation could dismiss. The Volturi have the resources to have conducted that evaluation before marching across the world in force. They have Alice, whose precognitive sight was available to them through her presence in Volterra at an earlier point, and whose gift, if consulted rather than simply noted and filed, would have shown them the truth of Renesmee's nature before any confrontation became necessary. They have their own intelligence networks, their own information gathering capabilities, their own access to the kind of testimony that would have been available from any vampire who had encountered Renesmee directly. A governing body genuinely motivated by the need to investigate a reported violation, with the resources the Volturi possess, does not need to arrive at the scene of the alleged violation with the full military force of 3,000 years of accumulated power before determining whether the violation actually occurred. They arrived as an army because they came as an army. The investigation is the pretext. The force is the purpose. This distinction between the stated reason for the confrontation and the actual objectives the confrontation is designed to serve is the central thing the Breaking Dawn gathering reveals about the Volturi, and it reveals it more completely than any previous encounter, because the scale of what the Volturi assembled makes the pretext impossible to sustain under honest examination. You do not deploy a force of this size and this composition to investigate a violation that could be assessed through inquiry and testimony. You deploy it when you have decided that the outcome you want requires overwhelming force to achieve, and when you need a legal justification to provide the confrontation with a surface appearance of legitimate governance. What outcome did the Volturi want? The answer is visible in Aro's behavior from the moment the confrontation begins, and it is not the enforcement of the immortal child prohibition. Aro's first action, after the formal exchange of positions has established the basic parameters of the confrontation, is to seek physical contact with Renesmee. He wants to touch her, to read her, to access the complete record of what she is through his gift, rather than through the testimony of witnesses or the observable evidence of her behavior and her nature. This is presented as due diligence, the responsible application of the most comprehensive information gathering tool available to the Volturi's leadership before making a determination that will affect many lives. It is not unreasonable on its face. But watch what Aro does with what he learns through that contact. He reads Renesmee completely. He understands, through the totality of access his gift provides, exactly what she is. Not an immortal child, not a violation of any law that exists, but something genuinely new and genuinely extraordinary. He understands this with the certainty that his gift always provides, leaving no room for genuine doubt about what he has found. And then he continues the confrontation anyway. He does not immediately step back and acknowledge that the accusation was unfounded. He does not withdraw the force he assembled on the basis of an accusation he now knows with certainty was inaccurate. He engages in a prolonged process of apparent deliberation that has the formal structure of genuine judicial consideration and the actual function of strategic assessment. Assessment of the gathered witnesses, assessment of the gifted members of the assembled opposition, assessment of whether the force he brought is sufficient to achieve the outcomes he actually came to achieve rather than the outcome the investigation's stated purpose would require. Aro moves through the assembled witnesses with his characteristic combination of warmth and penetrating attention. He engages with each significant individual in the gathering, expressing the genuine delight he always expresses in the presence of the unusual and the gifted. He encounters Benjamin, whose ability to manipulate elemental physical forces represents a category of gift the Volturi's records may not contain a comparable example of. He encounters Zafrina, whose ability to control visual perception gives her a capability that functions effectively regardless of whether a shield is present to block other mental gifts. He encounters Kate, whose ability to conduct an electrical charge through her skin turns physical contact into a weapon that bypasses the ordinary limitations of hand-to-hand combat. He encounters Siobhan, whose apparent ability to influence the probability of outcomes through focused will represents perhaps the most unusual and least understood gift in the assembled group. Each encounter follows the same pattern: recognition, enthusiasm, the reaching quality of someone who is not simply assessing a threat, but cataloguing a resource. Aro moves through the gathered witnesses the way he moves through any significant collection of gifted vampires, with the particular attention of someone for whom the gifts are the primary point of interest, and the situation generating the gathering is secondary context. Chelsea is present. She is working. This detail, which Jasper identifies and communicates to the assembled Cullen allies during the confrontation, is among the most revealing of all the information the gathering produces. Chelsea's gift, applied to the witnesses assembled in support of the Cullen Coven, is attempting to weaken the bonds that connect those witnesses to the Cullens and to the collective position they have come to support. She is trying to dissolve the loyalty that brought them to that field, to create the kind of emotional drift that might cause individual witnesses to recalculate their commitment to the confrontation's outcome. This is not an investigative tool. It is an offensive one, deployed in the middle of a proceeding that is nominally about determining the truth of an accusation, rather than defeating an opposition. The fact that Chelsea is working during the confrontation means the Volturi are not there to investigate. They are there to win. And winning, in the context of what the confrontation actually reveals about Aro's objectives, means achieving sufficient control over the gathered gifted vampires to either absorb them into the Volturi structure or eliminate them as independent agents whose capabilities cannot be allowed to remain outside Volterra's management. Alice's absence from the gathering until its final moments is itself a piece of the strategic picture. She left the Cullen Coven before the Volturi arrived, departed in a manner that appeared to her family as abandonment, but was in fact the execution of the only strategy capable of altering the confrontation's outcome. She went to find Nahuel, living proof in the form of another human-vampire hybrid that Renesmee's existence was neither unique nor inherently dangerous, and to prepare the information that would make the Volturi's pretext untenable beyond any diplomatic management. But Alice also prepared something else. She prepared a vision. When she returns to the field in the confrontation's final moments and approaches Aro and offers him her hand, what she gives him through that contact is not a gift or a reconciliation or an acknowledgement of his authority. It is a demonstration. She shows him what she has seen, the future that will unfold if he chooses to proceed with the confrontation rather than withdraw. She shows him the battle in the precise and detailed way her gift makes possible, and she shows him its outcome, not the outcome he came to achieve, the other one. Aro releases her hand and stands in the field with the weight of what he has just witnessed visible in his expression, in a way that his usual careful composure cannot entirely conceal. He has been shown a future in which he loses, not a future in which he merely fails to achieve his objectives, a future in which the confrontation he initiated produces costs so significant that even the long-term calculus of a 3,000-year-old architect can accommodate them. Jane cannot incapacitate the Cullen Coven because Bella's shield holds against everything Jane projects. Alec cannot deprive them of their senses for the same reason. The elementary force that Benjamin can summon disrupts the physical environment in ways that negate the Volturi's formation advantages. The combined defensive and offensive capability of the assembled witnesses, operating under the protection of the most complete mental shield ever documented, produces an outcome that is not the one Aro calculated when he committed the full force of Volterra to this confrontation. He withdraws. The language in which the withdrawal is framed maintains the ceremonial composure that Aro deploys in all his public actions. There's been a misunderstanding. The matter has been satisfactorily resolved. The Volturi withdraw in recognition that the accusation was unfounded, and that the assembled evidence establishes clearly that no violation has occurred. The language is gracious and measured and carries no acknowledgement of what actually drove the decision. But the decision itself, stripped of its ceremonial framing, is visible for what it is. Aro looked at the future Alice showed him and made a strategic choice. Not a moral one, not a legal one, a strategic one. The confrontation, as currently configured, does not produce an acceptable outcome. Withdrawal preserves the option to return when the configuration is more favorable. This is the moment where the mask slips most completely, not in any dramatic or declarative way. Aro does not announce that his purposes were never what he claimed them to be, does not acknowledge the acquisition agenda that the confrontation's construction makes unmistakable. The mask slips in the gap between what a genuinely judicial body would have done in that field and what the Volturi actually did. A genuinely judicial body, having confirmed through the most comprehensive information gathering tool available that the accusation was unfounded, would have withdrawn when that confirmation was achieved. The Volturi did not withdraw when Aro touched Renesmee and learned what she was. They withdrew when Alice showed Aro a future he could not win. Justice and strategic calculation are not the same thing. The moment when one is substituted for the other is the moment when the nature of the institution becomes unmistakable. What did Aro want from that field, beyond the withdrawal of the accusation's pretext? The answer is written in everything his gaze touched during the confrontation. He wanted Alice, whose precognitive gift combined with her tactical intelligence makes her arguably the single most valuable strategic asset in the vampire world outside of Volterra. He wanted Edward, whose mind-reading gift at the range and sensitivity he has demonstrated represents a surveillance and intelligence capability that the Volturi's current roster does not replicate. He wanted Bella, whose shield had just demonstrated in real time exactly what he had understood it would be capable of from the moment he touched her hand in Volterra years earlier. A defensive capability so complete that it rendered the Volturi's two most devastating offensive weapons entirely ineffective against anyone she chose to protect. He wanted Benjamin, whose elemental gift represents a category of power that operates on physical reality in ways that no mental gift or physical capability can easily counter. He wanted the Cullen Coven, not to punish them, not to adjudicate a violation, to absorb them, to take the most extraordinary collection of gifted vampires that the broader world had produced outside Volterra's management and bring them into the structure where their capabilities could serve the acquisition system's purposes rather than exist as an independent power that the system had failed to incorporate. The confrontation failed to produce this outcome. The future Alice showed him was the cost of pressing toward it under current conditions, and the cost was unacceptable. So Aro filed the situation in the same patient archive, where he files everything that has not yet resolved in the direction he prefers, and he withdrew with his force intact and his long-term options preserved, and the field outside Forks was left to the snow and the witnesses and the slow dispersal of the largest gathering of vampires in recorded history. Carlisle's coven survived. The witnesses returned to their homes. Renesmee continued to grow in ways that remain unprecedented and incompletely understood. And in Volterra, in halls that have been accumulating the same patient purpose for 3,000 years, the architect who built the system that failed on that winter morning sits with a complete memory of everything he touched and everything he saw and everything Alice showed him, and he thinks, because Aro does not experience failure as conclusion, he experiences it as information. The confrontation revealed a specific configuration of capabilities that makes the Cullen Coven, at its current strength and with its current allies, capable of producing an outcome he cannot accept. It revealed the precise nature of Bella's gift in its full vampire expression. It revealed Benjamin's capabilities. It revealed the scope of the witness network that Carlisle's centuries of peaceful engagement with the vampire world has built. A network that, in the right circumstances and with the right activation, can produce a gathering that challenges even Volturi's assembled force. All of this is now in Aro's archive. All of it is available to the patient. 3,000-year intelligence that has been building the most powerful supernatural force in the history of the immortal world, one extraordinary person at a time. The confrontation did not end the system. It informed it, and a system that has been running for 3,000 years, that has survived the Romanian Coven and the Egyptian Coven's managed resistance, and the nomadic world's uncoordinated independence, and every other configuration that the vampire world has produced that might have challenged it, does not stop because one winter morning in a snowy field did not go as planned. It adjusts, it recalibrates, it adds what it learned to what it already knew, and it continues. 3,000 years is a long time to keep a secret. Long enough to build walls around it so thick and so ancient that most of the world has forgotten the walls are there at all, has accepted them as simply the shape of the landscape, the natural geography of a world that was always organized this way and could not reasonably have been organized differently. Long enough to eliminate every witness who might have offered a contradicting account. Long enough to make the story of order and necessity and legitimate governance so thoroughly the only story available that questioning it requires not just courage, but the particular kind of imagination that can envision a world built differently than the one that currently exists. The Volturi built something across those 3,000 years that has no real equivalent anywhere in the human world, or the immortal one. Not an empire exactly, though it functions with the acquisitive patience of one. Not a collection, though collection is at the heart of its method. Something closer to a garden, tended with extraordinary care across an extraordinary span of time, in which the most remarkable things the human world produces are identified before they fully bloom and transplanted into soil that serves purposes they did not choose and may not fully understand. Every gifted vampire in Volterra is a human being who is found. Every extraordinary ability in the guard is a human trait that was recognized, assessed and acquired at the moment most advantageous to the gardener, rather than to the garden's newest inhabitant. Jane and Alec burn with the specific fire of their worst human moment, made eternal and weaponized. Dimitri tracks with the particular sensitivity of a mind whose human version already reached toward others in ways ordinary minds do not. Chelsea shapes loyalty with the same capacity for understanding emotional bonds that, in some gentler human life, might have made her simply someone people trusted without knowing exactly why. They are all, in the end, people who were extraordinary before anyone made them immortal. People whose gifts were already present, already visible to eyes patient enough and knowledgeable enough to see them. People who were found by the system before the system's architect made them into the system's instruments. And then there is Bella Swan, who was also found, recognized, assessed, understood, with perfect clarity by the being most qualified in all the world to recognize what she carried, who was supposed to follow the same path that every other extraordinary human the system identified has followed across 3,000 years of its careful operation. She did not. She was found first by someone who had no interest in what she could become for him, only in who she already was. And that difference between being found by a system and being found by a person is what changed everything. Her gift did not end up in Volterra. It ended up protecting the one family willing to stand in that field and refuse. Some extraordinary things cannot be claimed. Some gifts choose their own direction. And sometimes the most powerful force in a world built on control is simply someone who was never afraid of it. Sleep now, my peaceful dreamers. You have wandered far enough into the dark for one night. Let these ancient halls fade. Let the candlelight dim, and let whatever extraordinary thing lives quietly inside you carry you gently the rest of the way into the deep and dreamless dark. Good night.